You know, the most important thing about making videos about fictional pirates on the internet is to have a good hook. And well, here it is. This is Sir Crocodile, and he quite literally single-handedly, because of the hook, changed the tone of the entire series. Crocodile is the iconic gold standard of villainy, and we're going to analyze why that is. Especially because if you compare Crocodile to more modern antagonists, then on paper, Crocodile falls a little bit short. But on different paper, the actual manga paper, Crocodile managed to do something that no villain before him and arguably no villain after him managed to accomplish. But this is bigger than a single Crocodile. Because ladies and gentlemen of the Grand Fleet, we are on a mission. We are going to rank every major antagonist in One Piece in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, starting with the legendary Sir Crocodile. So let's figure out what makes Crocodile hit so damn hard. And the first criteria for an amazing villain is simple. It's how much of a threat they actually pose to the protagonist. And in Crocodile's case, that threat can be calculated by the dangerous equation of power multiplied by intelligence. Because Crocodile is an exceptional academic. He has a polished understanding of science, politics, culture, and geography. In fact, there was even that one time where he gave Luffy a geography quiz mid-fight. Okay, Straw Hat, the prevailing winds in this area always blow from north to south. Now, if this sandstorm were to head south, growing stronger as it went, what would lie in its devastating path? And then you've got Luffy there making the same faces we all do when we encounter an unexpected question in an exam. In the grand scheme of things, Crocodile is nowhere near the most powerful villain in One Piece. Nowhere near it. If he gets caught up in a 1v1, he's losing to almost anyone with a pretty decent level of strength. However, Crocodile's existing power compounded by his intelligence is what makes him so ridiculously dangerous. He's the kind of guy who actively anticipates his plans failing, so he has backups and even backups for his backups, like the ludicrous situation with the bomb in Alabama. This makes Crocodile quite the overwhelming opponent for Luffy in particular, because thinking is very much the thing that he doesn't tend to do. Which is not to undersell Crocodile's power though. Due to when he appears in the series, his abilities are overwhelming. Smoker was of course the first Logia that the crew ran into, but Crocodile was the first Logia that Luffy could not run from and had to figure out how to beat. A seemingly impossible task, and one that Luffy failed at many times. Crocodile impaled Luffy, he buried him alive, sucked every bit of moisture out of him, and fatally poisoned Luffy. There isn't a single round of Luffy versus Crocodile where Luffy comes out cleanly on top, or arguably on top at all. A lot of people forget this, but in their final fight, Crocodile poisoned Luffy, and if Robin hadn't had the antidote, then Luffy would have died right then and there. So even at the very end, when his entire plan had come undone, he still had a backup remaining to ensure that at least he wasn't going down alone. I really cannot emphasize just how much narrative assistance Luffy needed to beat Crocodile. He needed to be a prophesized sun god chosen by fate to beat Crocodile. And even then, he only barely got the job done. And even after getting said job done, numerically, he didn't even surpass Crocodile. Luffy got a 100 million berry bounty as a result, but Oda noted in the SBS of Volume 36 that had the world government known that Crocodile was the leader of Baroque Works, then his bounty would have been 162 million berries. So even after being beaten by Luffy, Crocodile still takes a big old dub there. But speaking of dubs, like most things, the 4Kids dub did decrease Crocodile's threat, as he was the subject to one of my absolute favorite edits in the entire show. I love this image so much, as instead of impaling Luffy with his hook, what Crocodile does is artfully drape Luffy's body within the gentle crescent of said hook, and Luffy's being mighty cooperative in this piece of performance art because he just has no reason to let this happen. Crocodile is also the subject of some non-canon hype. In volume 10,089, yes, it exists, it was said that a fight battle took place between Crocodile and Douglas Bullet, which ended in a draw. And this is notable because the only person Bullet ever outright lost to was Goldie Roger. So Crocodile forcing Bullet into a draw is pretty wild and honestly completely unbelievable, which is good, that's why it's not canon. But the other thing to address with threat is the sheer scale of Crocodile's forces, which if you think about it, Crocodile was kind of like a prototype emperor, with a close crew of trusted officers and an expanded force of 2,000 agents. In terms of numbers alone, Baroque Works was even larger than the Whitebeard pirates, and we had to painstakingly work our way up the hierarchy just for the opportunity to face off against Crocodile himself. So even by modern standards, Crocodile was an incredible threat. But our second criteria is motivation, and having an understandable motivation is probably Crocodile's weakest aspect as a villain. As presented to us, it's very much, I'm evil because I like doing that. Makes me all happy in the sand pants. And in fact, what little of his motivation we do have is revealed after Alabasta, long after the arc concludes actually. But it is revealed revealed that like most of the greats of the world, Crocodile was present at Roger's execution for the One Piece speech and was one of thousands who took to the Grand Line with the dream of becoming the Pirate King. And it's possible that Crocodile was once very similar to Luffy, a wide-eyed dreamer. However, his dreams were crushed after challenging and losing to Whitebeard, which also gave Crocodile his trademark scar. And after this event, Crocodile had a moment of self-reflection, and after getting used to how he looked with his new scar, which was quite cool actually, quite nice and suave. In fact, Crocodile looked so cool that Vegapunk decided to keep that aesthetic feature for S Crocodile. But Crocodile realized that he would never be able to achieve his dream through the standard avenues of piracy. And not only that, not only could he, the Crocodile, not achieve his dreams, but he started to believe that no one could achieve this dream. It was impossible for anyone to become the Pirate King, full stop. So Crocodile settled for the next best thing, which is, checks notes, world domination. In chapter 165, Crocodile says, "I'm not interested in money or status. I want military might." So Crocodile definitely having given up on becoming Pirate King there, considering that he needs both wealth and fame for that. But nothing wrong with narrowing your goals. Let's focus on power. And with that focus, again, it's almost as if Crocodile was trying to position himself as an Emperor of the Sea, which makes it a lot funnier thinking about the future when Buggy accidentally takes that title after Crocodile put all of that work into Cross Guild. But going back to Alabasta, Crocodile's goal was to make Alabasta his home territory. His plan was to consolidate the people under his command after both the rebels and the royals, where they clashed and they died. But then Crocodile, was there to pick up the pieces. In a single night, the kingdom will become our utopia. But it doesn't stop there. And Crocodile's plans for after this event are more akin to what we know of the legendary Rocksteady Zebek. "When I become king, it will be a simple matter to recruit pirates to serve under me. I will increase my political power until it surpasses that of the world government. Mine will be a kingdom of legend." And whether he knows it or not, what Crocodile was essentially trying to create was a new ancient kingdom, a new single dominant force, one entity that surpassed the powers and influence of the world government. This guy was still dreaming big. He may have given up on becoming the Pirate King, but he went and picked something else just as impossible to do. So he didn't start dreaming bigger or more conservatively. What he started to do was dream adjacent. And the really cool thing is that even if everything succeeded on Alabasta, you can tell that this whole conflict was just one stage of his plan. Crocodile isn't the kind of blind fool who does lazy maths like, "me plus lots of power equals world domination, ... eventually." He knew that Pluton had the power to destroy entire islands. And I would be shocked if he didn't already have a strategic list of targets in his mind. Also, small note here, after Crocodile reveals his plan, King Cobra says, "The world government will never allow it." And Crocodile just replies, "Probably not." And I just like the wording of that because it implies that, look, maybe if you caught Emu on a good day, he might allow me to overthrow his entire government. Probably not, but maybe. Although Crocodile's plans are pretty funny in retrospect, because even if everything went all good, what he would have found out is that Pluton was buried under Wano, and you know what? Good luck taking that from Kaido. But the tricky thing to figure out is where Crocodile makes the leap for world domination and why. What is his motivation for that? Because we know almost nothing about his past, and therefore what drives his present. All we know is what, not why. Which means that you couldn't copy-paste Crocodile into a modern One Piece arc. He'd end up feeling quite hollow. But that's more or less irrelevant because he was in the right place at the right time. He was a perfect early series villain. It's forgivable because, again, it was so early on. This was long before Oda started to do his standard give the antagonist a fleshed out storyline, and I mean long before. That wouldn't really start until the post-time skip era. So whilst I would have ideally liked more, Crocodile definitely gets a pass here. But arguably the most important villain criteria is being engaging to the audience. The best villains in media usually have this sort of twisted charisma. Something about them that makes you actively want to see them on screen, even though every time they appear on screen, bad things happen, but you want it, you sickening audience member. And Crocodile is one of those villains. He has an aura about him that transcends the page that his art is drawn on, which is all about a combination of art and dialogue. Artistically, Crocodile is drawn with a lot more detail than most One Piece characters. If you take a standard close-up of Crocodile, you'll see that Oda gives him an insane amount of aesthetic attention. The lines around his eyes, the contour of his face, the shine of his hair, the detail of the cigar, it's all very deliberately designed to be confronting, to create a character who is aesthetically 1 or 2 stops closer to realism than what Oda usually offers with One Piece. It makes Crocodile feel like a living, breathing entity to you, the reader. And I want to remind you that that close-up was from early One Piece. In modern One Piece, this is pretty standard. But back in early One Piece, most faces were completely flat. You just did not see this kind of detail very often. And to demonstrate the effect of this, I did an experiment where I made a version of Crocodile if he was drawn in Oda's standard, more flat style at the time. And whilst there's still the bones of a compelling character there, there's no denying that he loses the majority of his villainous atmosphere. Art alone is not enough though. So I also want to highlight some of Crocodile's dialogue, because he has some of the flat out coldest lines in One Piece history. My absolute favorite Crocodile quote is from chapter 204, when Luffy tells him to return what he stole. And Crocodile is genuinely dumbfounded by the question and has to make a grocery list of crimes just to narrow it down. What thing I stole? Money? Honor? Trust? Life? The rain? And it's just like, damn. It puts into perspective just how far he's willing to go and how meticulous he is to remember each and every horrible thing he's done. Before Crocodile, I had never felt so threatened to my core in this series, because everything he lists is accurate. So what isn't he capable of taking away? And honestly, during Alabasta, the only thing Crocodile seemed incapable of was being stopped. Another thing I find particularly compelling about Crocodile is his dynamic with Luffy. Crocodile is of course the straight man to Luffy's clown, as well as the Moriarty to Luffy's Sherlock. Let me explain. Luffy is the only person in this entire saga who is capable of outthinking Crocodile, because Crocodile's sharpened mind does not have the capacity to anticipate Luffy's left field logic. For example, Luffy has a bit of a cool line when he confronts Crocodile for the second time. He points at Crocodile in your traditionally accusatory manner and he states, "That's why you stole the rain, because you're afraid of water," which is such a fantastic Luffy conclusion. That's not why Crocodile stole Alabasta's rain. It had nothing to do with it. But in Luffy's mind, that makes perfect sense. Water is his weakness, so of course he took the water away. That brilliant dastardly villain. But for an example that actually helped, how about when Luffy was able to find Crocodile in the tomb simply because he spotted a set of stairs and thought to himself, "That hole looks crocodilish." Crocodile again foiled by Luffy's unique thought process, which is a very kind way of putting it. I said earlier that Luffy was capable of outthinking Crocodile. That's not entirely accurate, but Luffy is essentially immune to a lot of Crocodile's logic. So it often does genuinely feel like a battle of intelligence just as much as it is power, especially because Crocodile and Luffy spend so much time interacting with one another, much more time than any villain who came before Crocodile. Plus, Crocodile does have some fun, compelling quirks. Something that a lot of people miss is that during Impel Down, after being freed, Crocodile appears in his own clothes instead of the prison outfits that the others keep. This is because Crocodile took the time and effort in Newcomer Land to go through their clothing options and put together a bit of an outfit. We don't see this happen in the manga, but the anime even has one of the candies fitting his shoes, and just what a boss. Even in the closest thing this world has to a literal hell, Crocodile just has to style all over everyone else. He would be a perfect fit in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which I think is best epitomized by this live-action Crocodile in the One Piece premiere show 2014, because just look at that magnificent face. But everything I've mentioned is essentially irrelevant without a satisfying payoff. Everything else is all about building the sandcastle that we get to knock down, and Crocodile more than satisfies. What I love about this climax is that Luffy needed a clever solution to beat Crocodile, and that rarely happens in One Piece. The solution is usually just punch harder or bigger, or punch more, because Luffy's final fights tend to be a bit of an endurance contest, but on this occasion he had to come up with the brilliant idea of using his own blood. Plus, during the climax, Crocodile makes it personal. Luffy up until this point has mostly fought for the sake of others, which is how this begins, as well as Luffy of course agrees to help Vivi, but Crocodile makes this a personal obstacle for Luffy by insulting his ambition to become the Pirate King. And that's why Luffy's iconic "I will defeat you" hits so hard. In the end, what's tipping Luffy over the edge here isn't Vivi, it isn't Alabasta, it isn't his crew, it's his personal ambition. The straw hat that broke the Crocodile's back, punched him through solid bedrock, and may be the most iconic villain defeat in all of One Piece. However, because this is One Piece, a truly great villain needs to satisfy one extra criteria, which is to have a satisfying character arc. And like all of the best villains in One Piece, I think that Crocodile only becomes a stronger character after his tenure as a main antagonist. There's a hint right at the end of Alabasta where Crocodile tells Luffy, "The more you know about the sea, the more impossible such dreams will seem," which hints at Crocodile's tragic dream-shattered past. But more importantly, how does Crocodile change as a direct result of his conflict with Luffy? Well, I think the most important change is that whilst Crocodile may have given up on his dream to become the Pirate pirate king, he goes on to develop a certain level of respect for Luffy, and perhaps even the seed of an idea that Luffy is the one who could accomplish what he thought was impossible. And this comes much later in chapter 578, where Crocodile saves Luffy from Sakazuki. At that moment, he yells at Jinbei, "If you want to protect something, do it right. Don't let them have their way," which is a pretty huge step forward for Crocodile. During his time in the Alabasta Saga, Crocodile had a very black and white view on every situation he found himself in. Whatever was happening, he knew the outcome, and there was no hope of changing it. However, now he's renewed to the point where he's willing to attack a Marine Admiral in the hope, just the hope, that Luffy will live. Crocodile never would have done this before. He would have seen Sakazuki gun for Luffy and he would have considered it a done deal. And then when the Whitebeard pirates join in, Sakazuki says, "Is every single one of you willing to die for the sake of that kid?" Which is brilliant because it's the exact same question that Crocodile had on Alabasta. He genuinely had no idea why Luffy was willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of a quote, friend or two. But now, after his encounter with Luffy, Crocodile is standing on the other side of that question because he gets it now. And he's looking at Sakazuki with a sense of disdain because he knows that, that used to be me. I can't believe I was like that. This is so cringe. And after the Paramount War, Crocodile even gets his very own Nakama in Mr. One. During Alabasta, Crocodile very much mocked Luffy for doing things like having friends and also caring about said friends. But now look at this, Crocodile has gone and made a friend. And to really hammer this home, we have the greatest piece of character development in One Piece history. My favorite image of Sir Crocodile ever is the cover page of chapter 860, where he's holding an umbrella over a very cold puppy. Very cute image, but it hits a lot harder than you may think. Firstly, remember that Crocodile is weak to water, so here he's making himself completely vulnerable for the sake of a young puppy. And secondly, it's also a very clever callback because during his final fight with Luffy, Crocodile called Luffy a pup. So instead of crushing the dreams of young pups, here Crocodile is now nurturing said puppies at his own personal expense. This is peak character development. And yes, I know it was an art request and therefore probably not canon, but I don't care. Even if it's not canon, I take it as a metaphorical shift. But look, the best part is that even after having his dreams obliterated twice, once by Whitebeard and once by Luffy, Crocodile is still active. Most villains lose to Luffy and they're done, but not Crocodile. You cannot keep him down, and even though this may not have been his plan, he's now put into a position to go after the One Piece and is back on track to pursue his original dream. So Crocodile is the gold standard, not just for One Piece villains, but villains in media in general. I honestly don't know if it gets better than him for One Piece. We're gonna find out, but to open up this series, we are going to start with placing Crocodile in the S tier. But you let me know in the comments, which One Piece villain would you like to see analyzed and ranked next? This is Don Quixote Doflamingo, one of the most accomplished antagonists in all of One Piece, who built an underground empire that made even the world government bend their knee to him. He was untouchable, which is why it was very surprising when he did indeed get touched. This is the rise and fall of one of the greatest empires in this world, helmed by a man who is an icon of One Piece, to the point where if you've never seen or read the series before, you've still probably seen him at some point. That's just how much Doflamingo has been elevated to a cultural icon. So what I want to know is, how did Oda manage to achieve this, and how does Doflamingo compare to other brilliantly written One Piece villains? Because we're on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the heavenly demon himself, Doflamingo. And I'd like to start with Doflamingo's strongest feature as an antagonist in my opinion, which is his compelling persona. What makes Doflamingo immediately stand out is that he does not that, and that his appearances were used so sparingly for the vast majority of the series. Doflamingo was first introduced in chapter 233, attending a meeting to, rather ironically, discuss Crocodile's replacement, which is funny because Doflamingo would go on to essentially become the post-time skip Crocodile and thus his replacement. So thinking about it, he was the right person to be at that meeting. But Doflamingo strolled confidently into the story, swinging a thick with so many seas bounty of 340 million berries. And after this grand introduction, he took a year and a half off, reappearing in chapter 303, where after Skypiea, we discover that Doflamingo was the man backing Bellamy, and that he had a rather sinister plan for some sort of vaguely defined new age. Lots of words there, lots of work there. So much so that Doflamingo then took a 5-year hiatus after this. His next appearance was frustratingly almost exactly 200 chapters later, in 504, when it was revealed that he was the owner of the human auction house on Sabati, and that maybe, just maybe, we should be paying attention to all of these smiley faces that we keep seeing pop up all over the One Piece world, because they all seem to lead back back to Doflamingo. All of a sudden, 6 years into this journey, we were starting to seriously build some momentum behind this curiosity snowball. I also love this scene in the anime because Doflamingo is just chilling on a prototype Dressrosa, which is this humble little beach, and they've got him in a cheap motel chair. But when the actual Dressrosa comes around, Doflamingo's living situation has been upgraded to a mansion and a mega couch. But for now, in 2009, Doflamingo participated in the Paramount War, and he had some highlights but remained a tantalizingly unexplored combatant. And it wouldn't be until 3 years after that, in chapter 682 titled Puppet Master, where it becomes clear that finally, literally a decade after he was first introduced, that it was time to explore Doflamingo. In terms of build-up, Doflamingo got more seed time than the vast majority of manga series have to publish their entire story. And even compared to other great One Piece villains, let's say Crocodile. Crocodile had about 30 chapters of sweet mystery before we got to tackle him, so that's a little over half a year of publishing time back then, whereas Doflamingo had 20 times that amount of time to seed his presence within the One Piece world, which was done masterfully by Oda. Even though across 10 years he rarely appeared, you could still feel his presence in the world and you knew that he was a big deal. The mystery aspect of Doflamingo is unmatched by any One Piece antagonist. You could maybe make an argument for the Five Elder Stars or Imu, but nobody has been as immediately gripping as Doflamingo. And after all that time, Doflamingo had the audacity to live up to the hype. From the moment the Dressrosa arc began until this very day, Doflamingo has never ranked outside the top 20 of an officially conducted character popularity poll. And to put that into some perspective, there's over 1,000 characters in One Piece who are eligible for such polls. So for Doflamingo to remain so consistently within that top 2%, it means that even though he does very bad things, he's doing those bad things very rightly. And one of those right things is being a villain with an understandable motivation. Don't confuse understandable with empathetic. I understand why Doflamingo is the way he is, because he was raised as a world noble. He was indoctrinated to the point where it became ingrained into his life's philosophy. I understand that, but I don't empathize with it, and I don't need to. All I need to know is that every action he takes is performed with the core belief that he is a superior being above those that he's forced to congregate with. Which is why I can also forgive a lot of Doflamingo's poor decision making during the Dressrosa arc, because that's just who he is. Someone with such an ingrained superiority complex is not going to plan for an event where his schemes are thwarted, because the idea of that happening never even enters his mind, which makes him fascinating because he's so smart and so dumb at the same time. An example that I like to point out is that time when Doflamingo tried to kill Fujitora. He attacks the Marine Admiral and says, "Hee, I could have sworn I just heard you say, 'Get rid of me right now while you have the chance, Doflamingo.'" And the arrogance on his face to think that he could take on a Marine Admiral and that even if he could, he'd be able to get away with it. But here's the thing, right? Doflamingo, he thinks he's being smart. He thinks he's reading Fujitora's subtle intent and then decides to get in with the first strike. And whilst those are the general, obviously portrayed vibes of Fujitora, what this Marine Admiral is doing is playing a game of political chess, whilst Doflamingo is at the child's table playing fictional pirate checkers. Doflamingo is a man of above average intelligence who thinks he's a genius. And that's why his plan works for me. In case you don't remember, Doflamingo's ultimate goal was something world domination. He was going to use Trafalgar Law's Devil Fruit in combination with the mysterious national treasure, which would equal him being the best flamingo boy and crowned ruler of the world somehow. It really is that vague because at the time of this recording, we still don't have confirmation on what that national treasure is. But I despise world domination, both in concept and when it's used as a motivation. I just think it's such a boring way to write a villain. However, this is a case where it works, because it was established from birth that this world is Doflamingo's plaything. That's his right as a world noble. And because he was taken away from their society at such a young age, Doflamingo doesn't really have any concept of equality. He's never lived with his peers, his fellow esteemed world nobles. All horrible people, but horrible people who all respect one another. From Doflamingo's perspective, he's never had that equal. He's always been the special one in every scenario, and so of course he believes that the only natural goal for him is to rule the world, because he's the only one with the right to do it. The only extended contact he had with a fellow world noble was his younger brother Rocinante. However, Doflamingo was very protective of him and took on a senior leadership role. So what is usually a bit of a narratively bankrupt goal is actually the only natural conclusion that Doflamingo could have come to. It sounds stupid, so stupid, but it makes so much sense with him. And that's why it becomes so satisfying to watch Doflamingo bury himself in a grave dug by his own decisions. But there is also a very important, just a little bit of shred of sympathy to be had with Doflamingo. We even get a flashback dedicated to him specifically, and it's quite tragic, because Doflamingo's family were hunted, tortured, his mother died of illness, and all of it was objectively objectively his father's fault. Although I can't quite get to the point where I can transform that sympathy into empathy. I am not an emotional alchemist. Because the thing is, if he'd stayed on Marijwa and everything was fine, he'd become a full world noble and then he'd be causing untold horror to others. But a life of crime is also a very natural path for Doflamingo. From his perspective, the moment he was cast out of Marijwa, he was amongst the lowest of the low. All humans are scum. There are no clean humans. So joining the underworld to him is no different from living a peaceful life in a crime-free town. Basically, everything about Doflamingo, it just clicks. I've never had the feeling that he's done something out of character, which I have had with a few One Piece antagonists, which we'll eventually get to. But all of his decisions, whether they're good or bad decisions, makes complete sense for who and what he is. And so Doflamingo feels a lot less like a drawing in a fictional pirate comic and more like a living, breathing presence. And that's only enhanced by his brilliant aesthetic design. Doflamingo's design is very loud and eye-grabbing, to say the least. It commands your attention through the power of bold fashion choices, and I love the fact that he wears sunglasses. So long as there's a well-written character behind them, sunglasses always contribute to this beautiful air of mystery, because it gives you the feeling that something is always being hidden from you. There's always this physical barrier between you and the character, and so you can't quite connect with them. Doflamingo isn't a tangible character that you can grab onto and understand. All you see is the facade that he chooses to portray. And I do think it says a lot that the iconic moment of Doflamingo's defeat is capped off by seeing those sunglasses broken. How many other One Piece villains have this kind of object? Crocodile's hook is pretty iconic, so is Katakuri's scarf, but neither of them hold anywhere near close to the same symbolic weight as these sunglasses. It's such powerful branding. You can give anyone or anything a pair of these sunglasses and bam, they're Doflamingo. You can feel his persona through these glasses alone. Whether you be me, my wife, or my dog, we are all Flamingo. And you can even get yourself a Dog Flamingo shirt at storeglr.com. But there is a point in the series where we do see one of Doflamingo's eyes, and there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. I honestly question whether or not Oda should have shown that eye at all, but I'm really glad he never chose to show both of them, because Doflamingo would probably end up looking something like this and completely kill the mystery factor. Also, a big part of Doflamingo's persona is smiling. He's almost always shown smiling, which really adds to the sinister vibes, because it just makes you ask yourself, what kind of sick crap is he thinking at all times to make himself smile like that? I don't know. I don't want to know. Maybe I want to know, but it's probably not good. And really, in the end, you can never know for sure because he has such a surprising emotional range. What I love most about Doflamingo is that range of personality, because many of the world nobles are very one note. They're bad for the sake of being bad. Whereas Doflamingo is admittedly a horrendous person, but he does have these selective moments of intriguing humanity. And actually, Doflamingo quite perfectly explains his own feelings in chapter 747. I lost my mother when I was 8 and killed my father when I was 10. The officers in my service are family who have been with me through thick and thin. They're all I have, and I do not forgive those who laugh at my family. Is that understood? You know, if you read that quote and that quote alone, you might mistake Doflamingo for a protagonist, because that level of family bond, minus the parent killing, is really what you'd expect of, say, Luffy and the Straw Hats, although that's where Doflamingo's feelings cease. If you're outside of the officer class, then you're just, more human trash to him. But the fact that a villain of Doflamingo's scale is even allowed to have emotions on a similar level to how Luffy feels about his crew is endlessly fascinating and creates a lot of compelling dynamics. For example, on Ponkaza, Doflamingo is quite saddened when he has to ask Monet to die for him. It's an intriguing clash of that world noble ideology versus the human connections he's built. Doflamingo formed a real, genuine bond with Monet, but because of his world noble heritage, he still has to see her as disposable. And it leads to this amazing scene where Doflamingo admits he made a mistake. He says, "I've misread the situation. I've done a terrible thing to you all." And then he has to ask Monet to give her life to fix it. And she's more than willing to do it. In fact, she predicted that Doflamingo would ask this. That kind of antagonist crew bond is so rare. And sadly, even going forward in One Piece, we almost never see it. But in a series with such a heavy focus on friendship and found family, I love seeing a villain who is carried by his crew, nay his family, in the same way that Luffy is carried by the Straw Hats. Overall, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more compelling antagonist than Doflamingo. Every time he's on page or on screen, he completely steals the show. And really, when I think of the Dressrosa arc, I think of Doflamingo. So much happened during that arc, but it's all characterized under him. So he receives full marks for compelling persona and understandable motivation, but what we need to look at next is threat level. And this one's very simple. If the main villain doesn't pose some kind of threat, then what is even the point of having them? And Doflamingo is timed to perfection in One Piece because he's Luffy's first big challenge in the post-time skip era, much like how Crocodile was Luffy's first big challenge in the pre-time skip era. And when it came down to it, anything Luffy could throw, Doflamingo could take. Doflamingo strolled into this conflict with all three types of haki, including the very special Some Conqueror's haki, Luffy, as well as an awakened devil fruit. And I want to make this clear, not even Gear 4th Luffy could beat him. Luffy was unable to put down Doflamingo before his time in the form was up, and it was the citizens of Dressrosa that collectively bought Luffy the time to finish him. But honestly, power is the least threatening aspect of Doflamingo. I've brought him up a lot in this video, but these two villains are just so narratively linked, and my point is that Crocodile's plan was to take over Alabasta, which was thwarted, but Doflamingo feels threatening because he shows you what would have happened if that plan succeeded. Not only was Doflamingo able to enslave an entire country, but he was able to convince them to be happy about it. Doflamingo's true threat is terrifying because, like all good horror, it largely remains unseen and left to the imagination. His whole empire is relegated to the underworld, which orchestrates his activities on Dressrosa, making it appear to be a lovely, happy country, but with a series of twisted secrets that gradually get revealed one by one, each more horrific than the last. I don't know why I said horrific. Horrific. Also, one thing that Doflamingo did that really makes him stand apart from other villains was exert control over the world government. And I struggle to think of anyone else who has ever been able to invoke this kind of power, but Doflamingo, the absolute mad lad, was able to blackmail the world government. What he ordered them to do, they did. And we're talking about the same world government led by the 5 Elder Stars and Emu. For a time, they were obeying Doflamingo's orders. Again, no wonder he thought that he was entitled to rule the world. He had the world's undisputed greatest power working for him. Admittedly, it was very restricted powers. Doflamingo couldn't really ask for anything too unreasonable, but this is the sort of power that not even Emperors of the Sea have been able to access. Now, what I will say is that Doflamingo, after, lubing himself up and altering himself into these positions, he kind of screws himself over. On the one side, he's goaded the greatest military might on the planet, and on the other, he's doing business with Emperor of the Sea Kaido. And by business, I mean that Doflamingo is terrified of Kaido and has essentially become his middleman. Doflamingo was punching well above his weight, and there is some acknowledgement of that to his credit, but his superiority complex, mate. It's so out of this world that even though Doflamingo knows he's outclassed, he believes, because of his world nobliness, that he's gonna be able to eventually outplay each and every one of them. So Doflamingo's threat is definitely high, but it's still a clear step below the world government, and probably any Emperor of the Sea despite his very unique situation. Now, quite possibly the most important criteria for a villain. Does Doflamingo have a satisfying payoff? I personally think so, because before Wano, Dressrosa used to take a lot of criticism because the arc took over 2 years to publish, but considering that Doflamingo had a decade of build-up behind him, I think that commanding the story for 2 years is very appropriate, because that's what he did. Luffy was the protagonist, but during Dressrosa, it was the Doflamingo show. And I don't know if any other villain has ever been able to sort of take that title off Luffy, at least in my opinion. Again, when I think of Dressrosa, I think of Doflamingo. And there's also a huge element of satisfaction in the final attack by having Luffy smack Doflamingo out of the sky, very symbolically dispelling his god complex and forcing the taste of bitter, bitter earth into his probably open mouth. He's also being beaten by a member of the D-Clan, the now established enemy of the gods, which we see juxtaposed with Law watching the final attack. And really, it all just comes together flawlessly for me. The only negative I'd say about Doflamingo's defeat is that, again in my opinion, the anime butchered it by turning Luffy's final punch into a minute-long filler struggle instead of the instant and unstoppable punishment from the heavens that Doflamingo received in the manga. But regardless, I'm not going to judge a manga character based on his anime adaptation. So Doflamingo gets a pretty amazing score for payoff as well, especially considering that this was the climax of a 12-year arc. And the best part is that after that, he begins a new arc. And so there's one more thing I want from a villain, and this is very One Piece specific criteria I have, because it's something that Eiichiro Oda is so phenomenal at, which is giving villains a fully rounded character arc, extending beyond their tenure as arc antagonists. What I love seeing is the villain learning and changing. That doesn't necessarily mean change for the better, but I want their downfall to inform their future actions and see a visible shift. And with Doflamingo, I think we definitely do see that. After Dressrosa, he gets carted away to Impel Down, and in chapter 906, he already displays quite a radical shift. Doflamingo assumes that an assassin has come to kill him in order to prevent him from sharing the information that he used to blackmail the world government. And in response to this brain thought, he says out loud, "Just let the secret out. Power has such a short shelf life. It goes bad very quickly." This is Doflamingo coming to terms with the fact that he's not the eternal special boy he thought he was. He no longer has this maniacal belief that everyone and everything belongs to him just because of who he is. After being removed from the power struggles of the world, Doflamingo has developed a new perspective, and I think he realizes just how ridiculous a lot of his efforts were. And 50 or so chapters later, we see him again in Impel Down reading a newspaper and cackling endlessly to himself about what's going on in the world. The world never gets old, does it? Things are just getting good now. As a result of his conflict with Luffy, Doflamingo has done the impossible and learned a bit of humility. After taking a step back, he realizes that there are no players in this game, only pieces. And now that he's out, he's just enjoying the game as a spectator, watching people fight and struggle for the power equivalent of milk. It's nice while you've got it, but it's gonna spoil quickly, unless you have long life milk, but even that doesn't last forever. If it did, they would call it forever milk. And that's not to say that Doflamingo is out of this series for good. If he ever did escape Impel Down, then I do think he'd compete again, but with a refreshed viewpoint. So this sounds weird to say about a flamingo cackling in striped pajamas, but he's matured, and I would love to see where that leads him if given the opportunity. As for his placement, to me, Doflamingo is another undeniable S-tier villain who has everything going for him. He's compelling, understandable, highly threatening, so satisfying to watch, and continues to have a character arc to this very day. So you let me know in the comments, where would you rank Doflamingo, and which One Piece villain would you like to see next? This is Enel, the false god of Skypiea and an entity completely unknown to those inhabiting the Blue Sea, and quite thankfully so, because they have no idea the sheer destruction and ruin that he could call upon them. Enel is a fantastic One Piece villain whose greatness is masked by the Iron Curtain of Skypiea, a traditionally overlooked arc that almost 20 years after it concluded, turned out to be one of the most absurdly important pieces of world building, and Enel is no exception. And we're going to re-examine him today, because we're on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, today featuring God Enel. So Enel probably has one of the most uniquely fearsome introductions in all of One Piece, because we don't actually see him. We don't get to see him for quite some time. But oh my crap do we experience him. Because whilst on what she thought was a lovely sky holiday, Nami rides to Upper Yard and witnesses an act of God. An impossibly powerful and focused shaft of lightning descending from the even higher above the clouds that they already are, in order to smite a sinner. It plays very strongly towards the religious themes of the arc, because a lot of times when people share their experiences of God, they tend to be very isolated and personal, which is what Nami experienced here on her own away from the other Straw Hats. So two very important things about this. The first is that Oda deliberately chose Nami to be the first witness, because within the crew she has the best mixture of pragmatism and powerlessness, which makes her an ideal audience surrogate. And I think it's very powerful being able to take someone so grounded in tangible realism and then immediately making her question her core beliefs of the world. Because after this experience, she returns to the Straw Hats fully prepared to believe that the gods exist. And the second important thing is that, let's say those gods exist, that's bad because we've now angered them. Because Nami overheard Enel's priest discussing the Straw Hats, or as they refer to them, illegal trespassers, meaning that the Straw Hats are now the enemies of the gods, a concept that would eventually tie very neatly into the will of D. No admiral, no warlord, no emperor of the sea has ever been able to achieve this depth of terror upon introduction. Because when it comes to all of the them, we at least knew that they were living, breathing, and probably killable beings. But with Enel, we have no concept of whether or not he's even human, which is emphasized by the silhouette we see of him shortly after. We see what resembles maybe human features, but Oda has crafted it in a distinctly alien style. There's no emotional expression, nothing to indicate any kind of humanity, and overall it's something that we can't connect to. Almost like staring up at the statue of a deity. And whilst we as readers aren't meant to, fully buy into this because you're all very clever, you know from the beginning that something's up in this Enel is probably not all he seems. Even then, on first read through, you still can't help but wonder, yeah, but what if? Because in the very next chapter, we have another experience of the seemingly omnipotent god sending another blast of focused lightning to strike down Konus. And whilst Luffy does save her, this feeling of powerlessness is one that we're not quite used to in One Piece. We are dealing with something completely out of our depth. The fact that you could be struck down anytime, anywhere for seemingly any reason is the pinnacle of threatening. It's such a gripping and compelling introduction to a villain, and we still haven't actually met him yet. Now, if that's all there was to God Enel, then I would give him a perfect 10 out of 10 for threatening right here and now. But the idea that Enel is designed to explore is a bit more complicated than that. When we do finally meet Enel, he is a spoiled, bored, entitled man brat who genuinely believes that he was born as a god with a divine right to rule. And if all of that sounds a little bit familiar to you, it should, because Enel is a prototype for the world nobles, and his existence is a miniature world government all rolled into one. Now, some people may be offended by my comparison of Enel to the world nobles because of his power. He's strong in everything, but they're not really that different. Enel does possess a Logia-type devil fruit that allows him to conjure, manipulate, and become lightning, which allows him to personally smite, but the world nobles have access to 3 marine admirals that they can summon at any point and do more or less the same thing, but probably worse. They also both believe that they're untouchable. The world nobles have this divine sense that no lower being would dare enact violence upon us, whereas Enel just thinks that it's physically impossible because of his divine Logia fruit. But when it comes down to it, if either Luffy or a world noble is facing a punch from Luffy, then they're both getting hit pretty hard. And even though Enel is essentially invincible against anyone else, when facing Luffy, he has about the same chance of winning as someone like St. Charles. Luffy's rubber body is the natural counter to Enel's devil fruit. And you know why that is? It's because he is the enemy of the gods, which puts Enel in a bit of a tricky position. Because during Skypiea, he's both the most threatening villain we've encountered to this point, as well as one of the least threatening, because he can't even begin to stand up to Luffy. So whatever our experience of Enel's godlike powers were, is now Enel's experience of Luffy's ability to casually backhand him into oblivion. And this is a situation in One Piece where I do think that we've sacrificed the villain for the sake of the idea, which is not a bad thing. The idea should always be paramount. But it's really important to note that Enel is not designed to be your typical epic shonen antagonist. He's here to explore the idea of a false god, a cardboard cutout, a being who appears fearsome at a distance on stage with all of the right lighting and fun smoke effects, but in reality is incredibly fragile and poorly constructed when you get up close to really examine him, which again works perfectly for the arc. The idea, in my opinion, is executed immaculately, but I can definitely see why Enel leaves a lot of people wanting a little bit more from him as a traditional shonen challenge. And to be real, a lot of Enel is more difficult to appreciate in the moment because Skypiea is an arc that compounds exponentially in the context of everything that comes after. For example, the beautiful idea that Enel, the false god, is ultimately overcome by Luffy, the actual sun god, is something that really won't resonate until Wano. And there's all sorts of mind-blowing dialogue in Skypiea that takes on a completely different meaning now. Like during the final fight with Enel, Luffy says, "Here we are on this nice sky island, and you go and make the weather all thunderstormy and nasty. You thunder freak?" So the first time you read this, it feels like very classic Luffy. He's simplifying a very complex problem down to his own personal annoyances. But then you go and read this post-Wano, and it's like a declaration from the sun god himself, almost willing the sun back into existence by dispersing Enel's attack and screaming, "Let the sun shine." I don't want to get into this too deeply because we've now entered more general Skypiea arc territory, and I want to keep this focused on Enel. But all of this is to say that the role he plays and what he represents is much easier to appreciate in retrospect. So my next criteria for a solid antagonist is having an understandable motivation. And this is where I think Enel gets a bit misunderstood. Earlier I compared him to the world nobles, and one of the very purposeful decisions Oda makes with them is to portray them as almost comically black and white evil villains. They don't have overly complex motives, they do bad things because they're innately bad people, and they believe that they have the divine authority to exercise their desires to do all of the bad things. It is actually a little bit worse than that, because both Enel and the world nobles assert that they have a divine duty to subjugate the unblessed. But it's not something that they believe in to the core of their being. It's more of an excuse to do horrible things. In the case of the world nobles anyway. With Enel, there's quite a bit more to it than that. At the climax of the survival game, God Enel generously graces the finalists with an explanation as to why he's being such a prick and intends to destroy Skypiea. And he actually has some pretty powerful words. The roots of this conflict are much deeper than you know. Think about it. You are not clouds, but you were born in the sky. You are not birds, but you live in the sky. The foundation of this country in the sky is unnatural. Land is the place for land, humans have a place for humans, and a god has a place for God. Each has a place to which it must return. So Enel believes that the fundamental order of life has been unnaturally shifted. Land shouldn't be in the sky and humans should not be occupying the space of birds. It's weird. So in order to fix this, Enel has crafted a weapon of mass destruction, not to return the land and the humans to where they belong, but to punish and eradicate them for breaking the natural order to begin with. Unlike the world nobles, Enel isn't just being a prick by unzipping his pants and waving around his divine rights. He's actively trying to restore the order he believes in. And I think it's a pretty damn solid motivation for someone who literally believes himself to be a god with that authority and duty, which is something that a lot of people seem to miss. Whenever I see discussion about Enel online, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think he's a really flat villain in terms of motivation. And if I had to guess, I'd say that that's because there's a tendency amongst new fans to sort of blast through Skypiea, speed read it if you will, get past all of those frustrating speech bubbles and right into the punch fighting. But then once you get to all of that, you realize, wait a minute, why is he destroying the island? That wasn't explained. Which I think is also partially a sandwich effect of Skypiea being placed between the saga breads of Alabaster and Water 7. Skypiea tends to be considered the valley between those two peaks, and for a wide range of reasons that I won't go into in this video, doesn't quite get the attention it deserves. And as a result, neither does Enel. But I think he has an incredibly logical path to mass destruction. But we still have yet to discuss his actual ultimate ambition. At the end of Skypiea, we have a very left field motivation reveal for Enel, which is that all of this time his plan was to go to the moon, because he believes it to be a sacred divine world to be inhabited only by gods, to build his godly kingdom, which, to make the comparison again, is very similar to what Marijois represents for the world nobles. If you legitimately believe that you are a god, then it only makes sense that you would want to ascend into the heavens. So other than not reading his dialogue, the only thing that might hold Enel back in the area of motivation is that all of this is revealed quite late into the arc. And in this age of online media literacy and criticism, people tend to be very impatient and demand logical reasoning right from the get-go. And they tend to conflate their impatience with poor storytelling. Whereas I think it's okay not to understand why a villain is doing all of the things they're doing, so long as that eventually when it is revealed, it makes sense. And Enel makes all of the sense. It's a last-minute puzzle piece that completes the full picture of Enel, which we will then frame and hang on our One Piece story wall. So criteria number the third one for a superb villain is a compelling persona. And in this regard, Enel has a very captivating presence right from the get-go. Mostly because of that godlike fear that he instills in the introductory segment, but counterintuitively, it only gets stronger when we see his true nature because it turns him into a wildcard character. It asks, and I suppose answers the question of what would happen if you gave a flawed human the powers of a god? And that answer can be anything. He could do anything. I don't know what he's gonna do, but it's probably not gonna be good. Anytime Enel is on screen or on page, we could be about to witness anything from a devastating event to a lovely chat over an apple. In fact, one of my personal favorite Enel scenes is when he appears behind Robin and they have a tense discussion about archaeology, where Robin manages to fool Enel into confirming that the Golden Bell Tower exists, which firstly, great job by Robin, continuing to point out the flaws in this false deity, but secondly, I was on the edge of my seat throughout this entire discussion, because at any moment, Enel could have flipped. Robin could have said something to offend him, or Enel could have just gotten bored and zapped her right there. There was a very palpable danger here, and there always is, which makes Enel a very compelling presence to behold. He has a volatile range of emotions available to explore, which to me makes him much more interesting than your classic stoic evil villain guy. And Enel's aesthetics greatly assist this feeling as well. In fact, he is one of the most unique character designs in all of One Piece, which is saying a lot because this series has a lot of wacky crap. But then again, that's also the problem. Enel is in One Piece. And if anything's going to let Enel down in this category, it's that he's up against some of the most compelling antagonists in all of media. We're talking your crocodiles, your flamingos, your mochi men, and so many more. How is it even fair to be asked to compete with them? It's not, but Enel does his best regardless. But quite possibly Enel's strongest feature, and what he definitely has going for him, is one of the most satisfying defeats in the entire series, which is very important to me. If I'm not satisfied with a villain's defeat, then why did we bother to explore them in the first place? But Enel has one of, if not the most iconic defeats in One Piece, getting smashed into the Golden Bell with Luffy's golden rifle, sending the sound of the bell echoing all the way down to the Grand Line, and letting Mont Blanc Cricket know that the City of Gold was in the sky the entire time. So there's some symbolism here that would be reused with Doflamingo. Obviously, it's very fitting that Enel was beaten in the sky, as if being knocked off his godly pedestal. I also love that Enel was beaten by his own hubris, as he was the one who equipped Luffy with the golden fist required to take him down. And one of the most underrated satisfying aspects to me was all of the citizens watching Enel's body fall from the sky and seeing the Arc Maxim come crashing down and sinking below them. Let's just linger on that for a second. The Ark, built by God, is sinking. That's such a brilliant visual metaphor for falsehood. The only detriment is that Enel didn't quite have the legacy set up to make this hit as hard as other payoffs have. He was a villain introduced and defeated within the same arc. He didn't have the multi-arc buildup of Crocodile or the decade-long buildup of Doflamingo, which means that whilst I actually think that Enel's defeat is more iconic, Doflamingo's defeat is more satisfying because it put a full stop on so much that we'd been building towards over that decade. Again, it's not fair, but One Piece piece has stupidly high standards of payoff to compete against. And then there's my personal favorite part of Enel's story, which is his post-defeat character arc. Starting with Oda drawing Enel without his bandana, which revealed a surprising quantity of god hairs. But the really cool thing about Enel is that he is a very, very rare One Piece villain whose defeat at the hands of Luffy didn't leave him broken. He was beaten by Luffy, sure, but that didn't deter him at all, and Enel still goes after his ambition and actually goes on to make it to the moon, and it changes him. Remember that old Enel's motivation was all about maintaining that natural order, and remember how he thought that order functioned. Land, sky, moon. Humans, birds, God. Humans shouldn't be in the sky, and gods, they should be in the sky, but like really in the sky, not the plebeian bird sky. However, on the moon, Enel discovers the truth of the world, which is that humans didn't ascend to the sky, they descended from the moon to the Sky Islands, and potentially even the Blue Sea, which means that everything Enel had believed to this point had been turned on its head. The moon wasn't the land of the gods, it was the ancestral home of the sky people. And what's worse is that once Enel got to the moon, all he discovered was more types of ungodly vermin to deal with, such as the incident with the space pirates. But he does find and activate a legion of automata, and essentially achieves his dream of starting a godly empire on the moon. I mean, just what an absolute boss. He gets to the moon, learns the harsh reality of the universe, and then decides, screw it, I'm gonna do what I wanted to do anyway. It's very Luffy-like. And in that way, I have a lot of respect for Enel. He's had a lot of world noble comparisons in this video, but his driving force is infinitely more impressive, and I'm very excited to see what Enel does when and if he comes back into the main story. But overall, as a villain, Enel aces a lot of criteria with motivation, satisfying payoff, and a great post-defeat arc. But I think he falters with threat level because of the idea that Oda wanted to explore, the cardboard cutout god. And whilst he is undeniably compelling, Enel has to go up against the big guys, and in the grand scale of One Piece, I think he falls just a little bit short. But that still makes him a definite A-tier villain in my books, which I think might actually be a lot higher than many of you were expecting. But Enel is a fantastic villain, and I'd strongly encourage going back and rereading Skypiea. But you let me know in the comments, where would you rank Enel, and which villain would you like to see ranked next? This is Captain Kuro, the second smartest person in all of the East Blue, capable of conjuring 100 master plans in his mind brain faster than you can conjure a single thought of what you might want for dinner. But Captain Kuro has a big secret, one that surprisingly few people pick up on, and it's going to play a big part in this video because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the controversial Captain Kuro. So this is going to be a good one, because Kuro is such a weird villain. He has a lot of great ideas with, questionable execution. So let's start with our standard criteria for a good villain, which is threat. Captain Kuro was the main antagonist of the Syrup Village arc, and when it comes to threat level, Kuro is, well, he's a bit of a tricky turnip, because he comes at a weird time in One Piece. He's a very middling threat because he comes after our introduction to the world, but before the stakes get properly serious. And I think that his bounty is a great illustration of that. Captain Kuro isn't a big step up from Buggy. Buggy's bounty was 15 million berries, and when meeting Kuro, he's 16 million. So as an audience member, it's almost like, what's even the point? This guy can't be too much more trouble than the clown we already beat. And you're right, because he wasn't. However, Kuro's bounty is a matter of some controversy. It's generally accepted to be 16 million berries, but in the anime, that amount seems to change a lot. For example, in episode 45, we see Kuro's crossed off bounty, which lists 14 million berries, and in One Piece Stampede, for whatever reason, Kuro's bounty is featured in Buenafesta's bounty collage, but it has him listed as 15 million. And my only possible conclusion for these inconsistencies is that the anime staff simply did not care enough about Kuro to double check the canon number, because this hasn't happened with any other East Blue villain. Nobody ever messes up Arlong, Don Krieg, or even Alvida's number. Alvida. So this does not bode well for Kuro's ranking. The fact that the anime and the movie production staff can't even be bothered enough with him to get his facts right. However, what I personally like about Kuro is that he's a bit of a beta test for CP9. The idea of a competent agent with an ulterior motive spending literally years on an island to implement and execute a mission. He even kind of has access to one of the Rokushiki techniques, which he calls Nugiashi, meaning stealth foot, although certain translations decide to call it the pussyfoot maneuver, which makes Kuro sound like the villain of a Broadway musical. And it's never been confirmed, but this technique is shockingly similar to Soru. And I suspect that Captain Kuro may have accidentally learned a version of Soru. I also think that Kuro actually actually does a great job of appearing empathetic when he has his talk with Kaya, and he reminisces on how good her family has been to him. This sort of deception is fantastic, because seeing that for the first time did make me question if I was wrong about him. Maybe he is just a good dude after all, with some flaws. And I think it's important to give Kuro that credit, because he had me fooled for all of 2 pages, because shortly thereafter, Oda goes ahead and reveals that he is in fact the big villain man, and we were right to suspect him all along. And I do think that a modern Eiichiro Oda might have implemented this twist a lot better, like he did with CP9. I mean, imagine if the first time we met Lucci as a carpenter at Galila, and then 3 pages later he's on a Den Mushi, revealing that he's the main antagonist of the entire saga. Wouldn't have hit quite as hard. So I'd love to see a version of Syrup Village where Kuro being the villain is revealed later on, and maybe we're led to suspect that Django is the main antagonist. But then again, that does kind of mess with Usopp's whole story of knowing and telling everyone, but them not believing him. So I'm just going to leave that on the table for now, and we're going to discuss motivation, because Kuro has what I think is the most unique motivation of any East Blue villain. When you consider the likes of Alvida, Buggy, Don Krieg, and Arlong, they're all focused on the big picture of acquiring wealth, fame, and power to implement their evil agendas. And what I love about Kuro is that he's the exact opposite. He's doing everything he can to disappear and retire from piracy. What he seeks is essentially what Luffy wants. He wants freedom. And he's also quite similar to Mihawk. Kuro wants to live a peaceful life and is sick and tired of being hunted by the Marines. He even goes on to say, "What good are riches if you've always got the Marines chasing you?" And I think the quest for a quiet life is a very underutilized idea in One Piece. And with Kuro, it actually plays into his relationship with Usopp. Usopp and Kuro represent 2 opposing ideas in this arc, being pride and shame. Usopp, a man who has never gone out to sea, is proud to be the son of a pirate and holds that as the pinnacle of honor. And it's his goal to go on and become that brave warrior of the sea. Meanwhile, Kuro, a man who is an actual piracy veteran, is disgusted to so much as be associated with the word. He's ashamed of what he was, and he is willing to do absolutely anything to erase that part of his life. It's like having a pair of hands so dirty that no amount of washing will ever clean them. Kuro says, "Ouch, damn spot," but then the damn spot says, "Lol, you mad, bro?" And Kuro is genuinely antagonistic towards Usopp, and the reason for that isn't because Kuro's a bad dude, it's because Usopp is the son of a pirate. Kuro has such a deep disgust of his previous profession, and he's projecting that onto Usopp, who holds that profession in the highest regard. And there's one very telling interaction where Kuro even states that Usopp has a gift for deceit, and that he wouldn't put anything past him, that filthy pirate-loving man, which is classic projection, because Kuro is the one with the gift for deceit and plans on doing all of the really bad things. He calls Usopp trash, he calls his father filthy, he calls both of them animals, but it's all projection, especially since Kuro's entire crew are themed on animals. So Kuro hates Usopp because Usopp is a reflection of what he hates being. Kuro even says that Kaya's estate is no place for someone like him, when what he means to say is that it's no place for someone like him, which I know is the same sentence, but the hims imply different people. Now, speaking of different people, Kuro is actually 2 people, and not a lot of readers pick up on that, which is a shame because to me, this forms the most compelling part of his persona. There's even one point where he says, "Captain Kuro has outlived his usefulness," as if he literally wants to become another person, which he does with his butler persona Klahadore. And it makes you wonder if Kuro was even his original identity or just another alias that he took on and became at one stage, because he does make efforts to completely transform himself right down to the basic use of language, which I will admit is a lot less apparent in English, but in Japanese there is a distinct difference between when Kuro is talking and when Klahadore is talking. It's like listening to 2 different people through simple choices, such as Kuro using the pronoun ore and Klahadore using watashi, which in English can both only be translated as I, but in Japanese this simple choice tells you a lot about a person. And more evidently in English, you can tell the difference whenever Kuro or Klahadore talk about death. Kuro is very blunt and refers to it as killing, whereas Klahadore, the pacifist, would never use such wicked terminology. No, he says accident. And this is another very important detail that people miss. Kuro himself claims to have become a pacifist, or actually I should say that Klahadore claims this, which is odd because we see him very willingly harm people later on, but that's because this is Kuro acting, not Klahadore. And we know that he's not just acting, he's not just playing pretend, because he tells Django that he's become a pacifist. He tells Django alone. There was no reason to lie about that to Django. If anything, hearing that your captain has become a pacifist might even undermine your faith in him. So Kuro actually believes that he's capable of becoming a different person. But having said that, I don't think this is portrayed as clearly or as powerfully as it could have been. But look, arguably the most compelling aspect of this Captain Kuro is that he's a super genius whose plans are all catered right down to the most minor of details. Kuro is a different type of villain, and in many ways, but he's the first intellectual antagonist that we encounter. By which I mean it's not so much his strength that we fear, but his mind brain. He's introduced to us as Kuro of 100 Plans, a master strategist with an eye for excruciating detail. And Eiichiro Oda even once stated that Captain Kuro was one of the top 3 smartest people within the entire East Blue Saga, with the other 2 being Ben Beckman and Nami. And this is all very threatening because Luffy can't deal with that kind of opponent. He's built for rubber fist fights, not pirate chess, which in theory makes Kuro the most dangerous opponent to date, provided that he can make good on said intelligence. But that brings us to the problem of writing genius characters. If you choose to do this, then as an author, you need to work overtime to make sure that these characters are always several steps ahead of the audience. Not just the in-world characters. You need to have the audience believe that this 2D fictional character is smarter than them, the 3-dimensional humans. And it also leaves these kind of characters much more open to scrutiny. Because if Kuro of 100 Plans has a plan that he's been planning for 3 years, and then there's a problem with the plan, then that's going to shatter the illusion of genius. But this is what I think most people get wrong about Captain Kuro. He was never a genius. He was a big-brained fish in a very small-brained pond. He is the sharpest of the dullest, the brightest of the dim, and all of the other metaphors. You get the idea. But Kuro has deluded himself into thinking that he's a genius. And it's really interesting because throughout Syrup Village, his intelligence is constantly being questioned by Django. Right from the get-go, Django tells Kuro that he wasn't sure about this whole plan thing, and then later on, when Kuro lets Usopp go after overhearing the plan, Django throws this failure back in Kuro's face when it ends up becoming a big problem. But Kuro is completely unable to accept his own mistake and insists that he was correct all along and that this is somehow Django's fault. Kuro is the most frustrating kind of person. A man who cannot face his own mistakes and can somehow contort his way out of any personal responsibility. He never makes mistakes. The mistakes are made by everyone around him. That is Captain Kuro at every step during this arc. Even right at the end, when his plans are obviously falling apart, he insists that the plan was perfect. But his plan sucked! Not just when it fell apart, right from the inception. When speaking about his own plan, Kuro says, "There's no room for error in my 3-year plan, and my plans never go off course." So no room for error except the following. 1. This plan relies entirely on Django and the Black Cat Pirates actually returning after 3 years when they could easily peace out and go do their own thing. 2. This plan relies on the Black Cat Pirates not being caught by the Marines for 3 years. 3. Instead of spending the 3 years gaining the trust of the villagers, Kuro could have just had Django hypnotize them, because there's no need for acting when you can control people's minds. And in that case, you don't even need to attack the village or risk drawing any unwanted attention at all. Especially since 4. Kuro got stupidly, and I mean stupidly lucky, with Kaya's parents dying without his involvement. And then with Kaya herself going on to become a very sickly girl, again without his involvement. Kuro did not kill the parents. Kuro did not poison Kaya. I mean, he did poison Kaya in the live action, but not in the actual manga. Kuro didn't do anything except for keeping a very well-kept house. So if he just infiltrated and gotten Kaya to pass away from something that looked like a natural condition, then no one would have raised any suspicion. 5. Why not get Kaya to write the will a bit earlier than the morning of her accidental death, perhaps even a year or 2 in advance, because nothing is less suspicious than a fresh will written hours before death. Furthermore, he didn't even need Django to hypnotize Kaya into writing the will. He just needed to threaten her, which is ultimately what ends up happening. Kaya writes the will without Django's powers. 6, and this is a big one, when Usopp discovers the plan, Kuro lets him go, allowing Usopp to form the resistance that stops Django and the crew, which we've discussed. Then 7, instead of simply accepting the anniversary gift, Kuro decides to out himself, kill in quotations Mary, and then at that point of compromise. There was no reason for him to do this. All he needed to do was keep up the act until dawn. But no, he initiated the plan the night before the plan was meant to commence, which is especially bad because somehow, number 8, Kuro fails to actually kill Mary, which then alerts Kaya to his betrayal, which is terribly out of character for someone who we are told is so detail-oriented. It's not out of character, it is his character. And if you don't believe me, then number 9, before the Black Cat Pirates are able to sack the village, which remember was the plan, Kuro attempts to slaughter each and every one of them, thus preventing them from enacting the plan. Masterful gambit, sir. His perfect plan needed them to take the fall, so what you gonna do now? Stroll into the village and kill a bunch of residents yourself? In which case, why bother spending 3 years to gain their trust? It was completely unnecessary. In the end, he starts killing his crew and abandoning his own plan whilst insisting that his plan is still the perfect plan. And in the end, I personally don't get a lot of satisfaction out of beating Kuro because we did not beat Kuro. Kuro beat Kuro. And apart from faking his own death, which was a genuinely cool, well thought out plan, I'll give him that. But apart from that, at no point does Kuro take the smartest and most carefully considered options. And he also leaves far too much up to chance, which is why the most generous analysis I can give this character is that Kuro was a man who thought he was smart, and that unearned belief in himself is what caused his undoing. But I need to admit, I don't know if that's just me trying to find an excuse for the character, because even if that is the intention, then I don't think Oda nailed it. I think that Captain Kuro as a whole comes across as a weakly written character, a genius stereotype that was used by an author who was perhaps a bit too young to really understand how a character like that needs to be implemented. And that choice harms him greatly. Kuro was set up to be this intellectual force to be reckoned with, which both raises the stakes but also significantly raises expectations. If Kuro wasn't introduced as a genius and instead he was just some guy of, middling intelligence who wanted to do some really bad things, then no one would scrutinize him anywhere near as harshly as he gets. Or if it was made super clear that his genius was a facade all along and then all of the mistakes, they become believable, you could even thematically tie that to Usopp, because he's also a notorious liar with no substance to back up the stories he's telling, and maybe we could have done a parallel story with Kuro to show that he's a liar who claims to be a genius in the same way that Usopp claims to be a brave warrior of the sea. And then Usopp could have seen how hollow Kuro was and used that as part of his reason to set out to sea and make his lie a reality. But we can't really have that because Kuro can actually back himself up, as he does have the strength and intelligence required to get to this middling point of, not genius but smarter than average, and quite competent but also stupid at times guy man. So in the end, I don't really know what to do with Kuro, and neither did Oda, because he has no resolution. Luffy beats him, we see his body fall onto the floor, and then nothing. Although anime watchers will know that in episode 45, we do see Kuro one last time, having resumed his role as a pirate. However, this did not happen in the manga, and anything about Kuro after his defeat is completely unknown. He wasn't arrested because there were no marines there, and in the live action, he's seen sailing away in a rowboat because I think that even they recognize that Kuro needed some sort of resolution, or at least a hanging thread of potential. And now Kuro is one of the only villains in all of One Piece who has never appeared again, which, good on him, because I guess that means he got his wish. Kuro was able to disappear from the story and not get caught up in cover stories and future events because he's completely off the radar. He could be off somewhere else implementing another 3, 4, maybe even 5-year plan that we have yet to see come to fruition because the entire story of One Piece so far hasn't even covered 3 years. It might be a case where at the very end of One Piece, Oda shows us a single panel of Kuro having successfully achieved his retirement, but also it's entirely possible that we never see Kuro again, and I personally have no expectation to. Or I should say I had no expectation to, because Kuro does appear in a gag one-shot called My Plans Never Fail by Ryo Nakama. And this was a promotional 5-page manga to tie into One Piece Stampede, where it is revealed that Kuro has retired in a small house somewhere, and for some reason still wears his butler outfit, I guess fully taking on the persona of Klahadore. But in any case, he receives an invitation to the Pirates Festival and decides to call his old buddy Django, who is now a Marine, and it ends with Kuro getting really angry and destroying all of his furniture. So this is a non-canon tie-in to a non-canon film, but despite that, I think this actually shows Kuro in his purest form, which is a deluded man who thinks he's an intellectual and belongs at the peak of humanity, but who is in reality a very small man who meets an equally small end. That's how I choose to view Kuro, because if he is meant to be everything he says he is, then Oda simply failed. And Kuro becomes a very rare example of a character who falls short of the hype built up by the author. But either way, I think that Kuro was the kind of character that East Blue was not quite ready to tackle. The simplicity of early One Piece was not a good canvas for this sort of figure, and Oda has since gone on to implement hyper-intelligent antagonists very, very well. So perhaps Kuro stealth walked so that characters like Crocodile and Rob Lucci could stealth run. And whilst Kuro does have some genuinely interesting ideas, most of them aren't fully baked, and in the grand scheme of One Piece villains, I really don't think I can award him more than a D tier. But you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Arlong, arguably the first legendary villain of One Piece, and the antagonist responsible for many of the most iconic series moments to this very day. But what I want to know is how well Arlong stacks up 25 years after his story concluded in 1999. That's right, Arlong is a villain of the 90s. And a lot's changed since then. So was Arlong really one of the greatest One Piece villains? Or is it all just nostalgia from a much simpler time when many of you didn't even exist? We're going to find out because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the terror of East Blue himself, Arlong. So with Arlong, it's important to note that we experience him as a bit of an incomplete story. We originally see what he is during the Arlong arc, and then 500 chapters later, we learn why it is he became the thing it is that he is. But even without that added backstory, Arlong is a unique villain for East Blue, and when he's first introduced in the very sexually charged chapter number 69, Arlong makes his philosophy quite clear. Money is good. It's the only thing a man can really believe in, which is a belief that he imparted onto Nami, which is something that she still partially carries with her to this very day. It's sort of like how when Law directly quoted Doflamingo saying, "The weak don't get to choose how they die." It's always really interesting when villains inform our heroes. But when it comes to Arlong, he's less of a pirate and more of a businessman. He's cordial with anybody who can bring value to his business. Like how early on, Arlong is bending over backwards to accommodate Captain Nezumi, and when Nami returns, he decides to throw her a feast in celebration. Right before meeting him, we are led to believe that Arlong is a terrifying, merciless fisherman, and it caught me quite off guard to see him so chill and seemingly kind in his introduction. And a very intriguing thing about Arlong is that in the very legal sense of the word, he never lies. He deceives and he manipulates, but every word that comes out of his mouth is carefully considered. And the reason for that is because lying is what filthy humans do, which is a lesson that was branded into his brain after being betrayed by Koala's village. After that happened, he simply said, "This is what humans do." And as an ever superior fisherman, Arlong will never stoop to their level. He prides himself on honesty and integrity, or more accurately, his interpretation of honesty and integrity. Because Arlong believes that he has a divine right to rule over humans and describes the dynamic as follows. "We fishermen are evolved humans who have developed the ability to breathe seawater. Our fish-like powers make us far superior to you. We fishermen are the lords of all creation. A human fighting the fishman is fighting the power of nature itself." And basically, as the lord of all creation, he gets to make the rules. He decides what the definition of honesty and integrity are. Although I will say that Arlong's overall goal is a bit divisive for me. He states that he's gathering funds to build the quote, Arlong Empire, which will rule the East Blue. I guess in his defense, at least he's not saying something like it will rule the whole world, because Arlong is a man who has actually experienced the true power of the world. He came face to foot with Kizaru, so this dude knows that he's not conquering too much, but has set his sights on terrorizing the weakest yet most manageable of all of the seas. And this motivation definitely works a lot better the first time you go through One Piece, because Arlong is the strongest guy we've seen in East Blue, who isn't Mihawk. We're gonna forget about him. And his crew completely obliterates every other pirate crew or squad of marines on this sea. So you think to yourself, mate, they could actually do this. Fishermen are strong enough to literally pick up buildings and throw them, which is a big upgrade from our previous villain building relationships. Don Krieg wanted to commandeer one, and Captain Kuro spent 3 years keeping one meticulously clean, but the Arlong pirates are the first villains to go F it and just toss an entire village. Each fisherman is capable of raw power beyond anything we'd seen to this point, other than Mihawk. If I ever make a statement like that in the future, just assume that I say other than Mihawk at the end. But Arlong is the leader of these guys. The dude ate a cannonball fired straight into his face. He is a serious threat at this point in the story. He's the first villain that I wasn't 100% sure that Luffy could beat. And whilst he didn't give Luffy the challenge that, others would down the line, he was a very distinct step up and a preview of where One Piece was going. Arlong was also significantly smarter than any other East Blue villain. Even Captain Kuro, and his whole thing was intelligence. But Arlong out-intelligented him. Not me, I couldn't even say the word properly. Arlong knew what he wanted, he knew how to get it, and scarily often, it didn't even require violence to achieve. Arlong implements select examples of violence, and mostly elects to manipulate people with words rather than actions, such as striking a deal with Captain Nezumi, which meant that he came with an enhanced sense of hopelessness, because not even the Marines, the police of this world, could help, which also symbolized a culmination of East Blue. To this point, we'd fought against both pirates and Marines, but this was the first case where we were up against both forces at once. But Arlong's true threat in this series can be summed up in one word, and that word is Nami. The reason why he works so well is because he is one of the only villains to be able to reach into us and hurt us at our core. The fact that he was able to make a Straw Hat's whole childhood a living hell is a badge of dickery that almost no other antagonist can claim. Even Judge isn't as bad because at least Sanji got to spend a good chunk of his childhood with Zeph. So the fight against Arlong is a battle for Nami, featuring Luffy, who insists that she's the navigator for his crew despite her betraying him, and Arlong, who insists that he's Nami's shipmate despite him betraying her. But one of my favorite things about Arlong is that over the course of this arc, we gradually strip away and break him down to reveal his true nature. As stated before, he starts out quite level-headed, logical, and even accommodating, such as when he let Zoro off with a warning for calling him a, quote, damn dirty half-fish, which, wow, Zoro, just wow. He also gets very defensive on Nami's behalf, even when she's being criticized by members of his crew, his fellow fish brothers. But it's like being seduced by the devil or a politician, I don't know, whichever's worse, because Arlong, yes, he seems perfectly reasonable at first, but all of the pleasantries are designed to hide a darkness beyond all imagination. And the first glimpse of his true self only really comes out when Usopp attacks him to save Genzo. After this, Arlong is enraged and he screams, "A puny, worthless human dared to attack me!" So Arlong, he puts on a good mask, but it doesn't take more than a slight breeze to blow that mask off, which makes him very volatile and very compelling. Every scene featuring Arlong is interesting because you never quite know what you're going to get. Is he going to be the calm and collected business fish? Is he going to be the compassionate crew captain? Is he going to be the sadistically cruel torturer? Or is he going to become the over-the-top violent racist? Arlong has a range of bad things, but that's a good thing. And just as a side note, I love that the first Straw Hat to stand up to Arlong in this arc is Usopp of all people, the weakest person on the island attacking the strongest, and the person who, on paper, most proves Arlong's belief about how humans always lie, and also how pathetically weak they are compared to fishmen. But Arlong puts on a good facade, and even masquerades as wanting peace by banning weapons in Kokoyashi Village because, and I quote, "weapons give birth to evil thoughts and violence. They're the #1 threat to peace." And honestly, Arlong's words here, they're not entirely unreasonable, because in some sort of ideal utopian world, no one would have a need for weapons. But this is a two-part statement. Arlong goes on to finish this thought in the next chapter when he states, "Possession of weapons is sedition. It's a threat to the peace of our dominion." So here, Arlong has used his divine right to change the definition of the word peace to one that suits his personal preferences. And something else that I find strangely compelling about Arlong is that he's a villain who speaks through his eyes. He does his best to always maintain that joyous facade, but his true emotion is always in the eyes. Like when Luffy first invaded Arlong Park, there's this panel seared into my brain with Arlong smiling as if he's having some sort of great time, but his eyes are breaking down and cracking with uncontrollable rage. And eyes are a language that Arlong speaks fluently, as he's also able to read Zoro's eyes and states that these are not the eyes of a dying man, proceeding to show a very unusual degree of caution towards a human and deciding that he needed to kill Zoro right then and there, all because he read his eye language. And another thing that you'll notice about almost all of the best One Piece villains is that they smile a lot, and that is intentional on the part of Oda to challenge Luffy, the Joy Boy. A lot of the greatest clashes in One Piece match Luffy's real smile up against an antagonist's fake smile, and the fake ends up crumbling every time, with Arlong being no exception. Arlong's facade and, dare I say, hypocrisy doesn't end there though, because he went on to emulate the exact same thing that put him on this path to begin with. Fishmen are oppressed primarily due to the world nobles, and Arlong essentially became a mini world noble by adopting their beliefs in their divine right to rule, as well as adopting their taxation system of having all of the villagers under his control paying him a regular tribute, because as we all know, money is good. The one taboo he did not commit was slavery, at least not in the sense of physically chaining people up and like forcing them to do things. Although 4Kids Arlong did lock Belmare in a dungeon, and live action Arlong did physically chain up Nami to draw maps for him, neither decision I'm a fan of because it's a bit on the nose when it comes to the idea of slavery. This is another one of those selective Arlong beliefs, but the classical physical chain slavery is a line that Arlong wouldn't cross. Not with the history of his race, and not after having been a prisoner himself. However, he did manage to achieve essentially the same thing without the chains. Nami has this illusion of freedom because she can come and go as she pleases, but she always has the metaphorical chain of the villagers pulling her back and the map room to act as her cell. So by classic Arlong logic, he's able to technically say that Nami's free while still enslaving her, and thus proving that he doesn't need to sink to the lows of humanity humanity. I should say that amongst all of this terribleness, he does have one genuinely positive trait though, which is that he cares for his crew. And no East Blue villain to this point has used their crew as anything other than disposable pawns. But Arlong isn't just working for himself. He's working to ensure the prosperity of his crew, and he refers to each and every one of them as brothers, in much the same way that Whitebeard refers to his crew as his sons. Such as when he comes back to Arlong Park and discovers that Zoro defeated/killed, and it's not really clear, his crew, Arlong does the stereotypical drop to your knees and yell out at the sky at just how unjust the world is. Sort of like the Klingon death ritual, he screams out to warn the afterlife that a fishman is about to arrive and cause trouble, which is a very different reaction to when Usopp attacked him. There he couldn't believe that a filthy human would dare to attack his perfect fish himself. But here Arlong's anger is laced with sorrow and loss, which is something that to this day we still don't really see from the more intricately written villains that have arcs spanning whole sagas or even multiple sagas. It's a very rare show of vulnerability for One Piece antagonists as a whole. And it happens again when Zoro and Sanji defeat Hachan and Kurubi. Arlong enters this state where, in the officially colored manga, it almost looks like he's activated Gear 2nd, but it shows that he takes his bond seriously, and much like Luffy, he is stronger when his comrades are being threatened. But obviously the most memorable Arlong moment is the betrayal of Nami, which is one of the most hard-hitting scenes in One Piece to this very day and always will be. And the worst part about it is just how clinically he did it. As we've explored, Arlong goes to great lengths not to lie, and here Arlong chose his words like a lawyer from the very beginning. He said that if Nami brought him 100 million berries, then he'd release the village. But that she did not do. She did not literally end up bringing him 100 million berries. Instead, Arlong got Captain Nezumi to confiscate it, which in a court of fictional pirate law, Arlong would win that case. And one question I tend to ask when thinking about Arlong is what would have happened if Nami did bring him the money without being interrupted by Nezumi? Part of me would like to think that he would honor the deal, if for nothing else out of his desire to be above the deceptions of humanity, but a significantly larger part of me just knows that he probably would have found another semantic loophole to get out of it, because Arlong is a combination of cruelty and greed. Arlong takes great pleasure in causing pain to humans, and he seems to favor psychological pain. But he's also a smart man with his economics in order. He knows that he can extract more value through this method, even though he could afford to let one village go. And after all of this manipulation, semantics, and pushing a beloved character to stab herself in the arm, what we needed more than ever was a good old-fashioned Luffy ass whooping. When we talk about the best punches in One Piece, that conversation is always dominated by St. Charles or Bellamy, or maybe even Kuma punching Saint Saturn very recently. But Luffy's first punch on Arlong was the OG satisfaction punch. And it's also satisfying to watch Luffy dismantle Arlong mentally in addition to physically, because Luffy has something I like to refer to as the gift of being so dumb he's smart, which is best demonstrated when Arlong asks if he knows the difference between the two of them, and Luffy answers, "Our noses?" To Arlong, his species is everything. His most core beliefs stem from this almost religious faith in fishman superiority and a very clear distinction from humanity. And then you stack a guy like that up against Luffy, someone who is too dumb to even register that there's a difference in species. Luffy is the most pure example of a human we could have asked for, and from then on, every moment of Luffy versus Arlong is euphoric. In fact, my only complaint is that Luffy doesn't get to beat him up anywhere near as much as I would have liked. But that final attack is both perfect and iconic. And that's not the end of Arlong, because his development goes on to happen in reverse. We see what he became, and then later why he became that thing through the Fisher Tiger flashback. And all of a sudden, a lot of stuff started to make uncomfortable amounts of sense. Like the fact that Arlong Park was this poor imitation of the Sabati Park that he admired as a child. There's a lot of stuff that brings you dangerously close to empathizing with Arlong. But to be clear, this is nowhere near a fall from grace story. Arlong is still incredibly brutal in this flashback, and he does outright state that someone's got to crush the humans and break their pride. And at no point is he convinced that returning Koala to her village is going to do any good. He has no faith that a single village knowing about the good deeds of fishermen will have any impact, which we know through Luffy's journey is wrong. Luffy started small as well. He began with saving tiny villages, collecting allies, which snowballed into saving countries, acquiring a grand fleet, and these days a colossal chunk of the world supports him because of everything he's done, big and small. And the same could have happened for human-fishman relations if things here had gone a bit differently. I don't think Arlong had to turn out this way. All he had to do was see one ray of genuine hope, but he didn't even get that. Instead, the Sun Pirates were ambushed, and Arlong's beliefs were set in stone. This is what humans do. He he reaffirmed to himself. And again, with the context of this flashback, it is scarily possible to come close to empathizing with Arlong, because in this moment, he wasn't wrong. He knew that things would end badly. The only thing he couldn't predict was just how badly. And from his perspective, there was no hope for a future with peace between humans and fishmen. So to a large degree, Arlong is a product of the environment that the world government created, which doesn't even come close to absolving him of anything, because he did share that environment with Jinbei, who turned out to be a much more upstanding member of society. But I do really appreciate having this extended Arlong development regardless. And we do also have to recognize that in an unfortunate way, we have Arlong to thank for the Nami we have today, because people are the sums of their experiences, both good and bad, and Arlong's tyranny managed to spawn a lot of good in Nami. Like the scene where she's at Belmer's grave and she decides that she's not going to cry anymore and to get stronger in her own way. She had to, because she didn't want to risk anyone else getting hurt for helping her, which applies to all aspects of Nami, including navigation, as she had to learn how to sail before she even hit double digits. Without Arlong, we may not have the skilled navigator we need today to get to Laugh Tale. I'm not saying he did the right thing, and I'm not saying that we should be on our knees thanking him, or thanking him in any way, even though I did say that we have him to thank, but it's to his credit as a villain that his actions shaped such a huge amount of one of our main characters. Of course, I would be remiss not to mention Belmer, who was also a major factor, but maybe we'll get into that when it's time to do the Dead Mothers tier list. However, for the sake of this list, Arlong ticks all the boxes for a phenomenal villain, and he's what East Blue sorely needed to take this manga to the next level. But whilst he does tick all the boxes, I don't think he ticks them as boldly and with as much depth as later antagonists. Arlong was a fantastic step up, but if he was the true peak of One Piece, then this series wouldn't have lasted for a quarter of a century, so I can only grant him the status of A tier, which is the same tier as Enel, but I do think that Arlong is more iconic and impactful than Enel, so we're going to do something a bit special here and give Arlong an A+. And you let me know which villain you'd like to see ranked next in the comments below. This is Magellan, and he has the rare status of being one of the only opponents that Luffy has never been able to beat. He was a man trusted by the world government to handle the world's most dangerous criminals in his own personal hell, equipped with one of the most broken devil fruits we've ever seen. If Magellan so much as breathes in your general direction, then you're dead. We're talking that kind of broken. Prior to the Five Elders, Magellan was the closest thing we had to a literal demon, but I want to know how he stacks up in the series as a whole, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the Guardian of Hell, Magellan. And I feel like that's a pretty good place to start. Early designs of Magellan state that he was meant to have a title more akin to Guardian of Hell rather than Warden. But title or no, Magellan is the facilitator of the closest thing the One Piece world has to hell. Even on level 1, the Crimson Hell, they're torturing prisoners by releasing poisonous spiders into a forest of blades, so the prisoners can either let themselves be killed by the spiders or try to flee and inevitably impale themselves on all of the blades. Ideally both, I guess. Then during the introduction to level 3, the Starvation Hell, Oda shows us the corpse of a prisoner tied to a rack who they had let starve to death. Meanwhile, on level 4, they do the exact opposite and they literally cook prisoners in a giant boiling pot. So Oda drew some pretty genuinely horrific things in this arc, and proceeding through Impel Down is almost like going through a Diablo dungeon, with the demon responsible for all of it being our main antagonist. And throughout all of Impel Down, it is made apparent that Magellan is not to be treated the same way that we've treated every other antagonist prior to him, and his dominance is made immediately clear. The first time he even comes close to stepping into action is when he takes Boa Hancock to level 6 to see Ace, and when the prisoners start simping over Hancock and calling Magellan Diarrhea Man, he then activates his Poison Hydra, which is one of the more intimidating abilities that we've ever seen, just period. And on top of that, Magellan just up and decides to kill a dude, and he adds, "Never forget that I have the power and the authority to execute all of you right here and now." Quite intimidating, but it needs to be said that as much as Magellan positions himself as a demon, he is far from one. It's more of a facade that he puts on to maintain order and control, something that he quite literally puts on actually, because Eiichiro Oda has stated that Magellan's horns are detachable. But Magellan is strongly motivated by justice. It's quite similar to Sakazuki's absolute justice, just probably a step removed. Because I think that if Sakazuki were in charge of Impel Down, then he wouldn't even bother holding prisoners, he'd just execute them all. Whereas Magellan, even though he inflicts horrific acts on the prisoners and will kill them every every now and then, always maintains a purpose relating to justice. He doesn't do all of the things he does for no reason. He isn't a mindless killer. Nor will he allow any treatment of prisoners that he considers an injustice, such as the whole Shiryu situation. When Shiryu went on an inmate killing spree, Magellan stopped him and said, "These prisoners aren't here to satisfy your bloodlust, Shiryu." After which point, Shiryu was captured, tried, convicted, and imprisoned himself, which sounds a whole lot like that justice thing. With that said, it takes quite a lot to cross Magellan's line of justice for those imprisoned and Impel Down, given all of the daily torture and killing. But Magellan is pursuing his own admittedly extreme sense of justice, which makes him a degree more empathizable than more of a pure monster like Shiryu. But the other motivation to keep in mind with Magellan is pride. For example, the very first thing he says to Luffy is, "For you to break into this impregnable prison is sullying my reputation," because Impel Down is a symbol of justice. If one prisoner steps 1 foot outside of these walls, then that symbol is broken. Now, in regards to this, you might say, well, man on the internet, did you forget about Golden Lion Shiki? To which I would say, technically, he did not step any feet out of Impel Down. He had to cut them both off. But also, this was not under Magellan's leadership. We do actually see Magellan in Volume 0, and he was a mere vice warden 22 years ago when Shiki escaped. So if anything, Magellan's got something to prove to his predecessor. Or had something to prove because, we know, it doesn't work out well. But all of which paints a picture of a very fearsome, loyal, and detail-oriented man-demon. But funnily enough, that was in no way how he was introduced to us. No. Our introduction to Magellan is a detailed explanation of his toilet habits. Warden Magellan has diarrhea for about 10 hours each day. It's part of his daily routine to hole up in the restroom. He also sleeps about 8 hours a day. Given time off for meals and breaks, he only works about 4 hours a day. Domino then goes on to say, but he can be quite productive when necessary, which is good. But it gets crazier because Magellan and his vice warden Hannibal then have this back and forth. "I'm sorry I had diarrhea. I got food poisoning from my poisoned soup this morning. I think you got poisoned because it was poison. As a poisonous human, poison is my favorite food. You know what they say, fight poison with poison. It doesn't work. That's why you get diarrhea." So Magellan inflicts this quirk on himself. And this is often seen as one of the most random and just simply bizarre character quirks in the series. But it's a reference to Magellan's visual design inspiration, which comes from a demon named Belphegor, whose MO is to seduce people into laziness and is usually depicted sitting on a toilet. Oda saw that toilet demon and he went, "Yep, that's my guardian of hell." But also Magellan has much more emotional range than I think most people remember. There's a page during his introduction where he switches emotion in literally every single panel. In the first, he's demonically releasing poison. In the second, he's laughing uncontrollably and goofily. In the third, he's being what I can only describe as petty evil. And then in the last, he is being love-struck by Boa Hancock. This single page of Magellan is an emotional roller coaster. When I was first reading Impel Down, I had no idea what to make of the guy. It was like he had every quirk in one piece all smushed into one demonic diarrhea ball. Zoro's demonic nature, Sanji's simping, Luffy's stupid joy, Nami's petty evil, and all of that is on top of the fact that he spends 10 hours a day emptying his eternally full bowels because he will not stop eating poison. And I don't know, it's a lot. I usually love One Piece character quirks, but I would argue that Oda may have overplayed his hand a bit with Magellan. And part of me thinks that this could be because of Impel Down syndrome, which is a term I just made up to describe Oda's tendency to overcompensate with comedy in particularly dark settings. You see this most prominently with the Impel Down and Thriller Bark arcs, two very gloomy, dark, and dreary locations, but also two of the weirdest and funniest arcs in the entire series. So because we're dealing with someone sculpted to be a representation of the devil, Oda may have felt the need to balance that out with every quirk he had in the stupid quirk arsenal. And I think it's a bit too much. Magellan didn't need this many wacky tendencies crammed into him. Just the diarrhea alone was plenty for me. Oh, and I completely forgot to mention, Magellan is also agoraphobic. Another quirk to add to the pile, but it makes him pretty perfect for Impel Down because he likes controlled dark spaces. And that's also my personal conspiracy theory for why he continues to poison himself. Because that gives Magellan an excuse to spend 10 hours a day in his nice, safe, and enclosed toilet. But the agoraphobia also probably contributes significantly to his strategic prowess over the prison, as someone with this condition would be hyper aware of the space and exits. The saving grace for Magellan is that his gazillion wacky quirks don't tend to get in the way of his job. When something needs to be done, Magellan is on you like a drop bear on a tourist visiting Australia for the first time. Much like that time when Magellan dropped out of the sky in front of Luffy, a panel that I love because there is a real sense of overwhelming power, and I love that Oda didn't add pupils to Magellan's eyes because it makes him look that much more sinister and demonic. Even the positioning of Luffy adds to it, because he's taken completely off guard, so he's assumed this defensive position. which tells you everything you need to know about how this match is going to go. Luffy is not ready for an opponent of this level. And then when the inevitable happens, Magellan's assumed last words to Luffy are, "This is your punishment, intruder. You will suffer for 24 hours and then go to hell." No One Piece villain has ever said a harder line than this. Although in classic Oda style, this is then balanced with the next time we see Magellan being on the toilet with a rather strained expression, because apparently even using his abilities causes him to have diarrhea. But Magellan is undefeatable. All Luffy can do is run. In fact, all anyone can do is run, which gives Impel Down the kind of tension to feel more like a horror movie than it does a shonen manga. Especially right at the end when Magellan is pursuing everyone and not a single person can stand up to him for more than a handful of seconds. And it's always worth noting that Magellan completely team-wiped the Blackbeard pirates as well. And were it not for Shiryu, Blackbeard, Vergis, Doku, Van Alga, and Lafitte would all be very, very dead. Let's put it this way. In the space of a single arc, Magellan faced 3 future emperors of the sea and soundly defeated 2 of them. Luffy, Blackbeard, and Buggy were all present for Impel Down, and I'm convinced that this event will be remembered much like God Valley. Magellan is Rocksteady Zebek, with Luffy, Buggy, and Blackbeard needing to team up together like Roger and Garp did. It's going to go down in history as a decisive and brutal battle where 3 future emperors combined their powers to beat the system. And even then it was a struggle because Magellan is a strategic mastermind. At every step along the way, he understands the correct course of action to take. And again, despite his various crippling quirks, he does not hesitate to take action. However, his one arguable strategic flaw just so happens to be one of the biggest mistakes ever made in One Piece, which was to free Shiryu to theoretically help out during an event that I'm going to refer to as the Riot of 3 Emperors, where Luffy, Buggy, and Blackbeard led their forces simultaneously on different levels of Impel Down. And I often see people on the internet accusing this decision of being a plot hole or out of character, because if you look at what happens afterwards, yes, it is a monumental miscalculation, but you do need to actually look at Magellan's working. Magellan has Luffy, Buggy, and Blackbeard attacking the prison simultaneously, and he states that he cannot request help from Marine HQ because they're busy preparing for a big ol' war. So Impel Down is completely cut off and has to deal with this unprecedented event themselves, which is a very desperate situation to be in, especially when you consider the pride of the institution. It is a global symbol of justice, and if there were to be some sort of mass breakout, then it risks destroying the public belief in the justice system. From Magellan's perspective, if he doesn't take extreme action right here and now, then at least one of the 3 groups is going to succeed and completely undermine the symbol of Impel Down. So he figures that, hey, this Shiryu guy just wants a free pass to stretch his legs and kill some people for a bit, which is a lot more helpful than having him not do that. I do think that Magellan's decision looks a lot stupider in the anime because, look, for whatever reason, they made it his idea to free Shiryu rather than Shiryu offering to help. So anime Magellan just up and releases a level 6 prisoner, assuming that he'll do the right thing with no promises, no evidence. That's stupid. So the anime definitely makes him look much less strategically sound. But that's not Magellan's greatest flaw. Really, Magellan's fatal flaw is something much more general, which is that he could not accept anything less than a perfect outcome. If Magellan was willing to accept that yes, some prisoners are going to escape, and then found the most logical way to keep that damage to a minimum, then Impel Down would have had a much darker ending for our protagonists. But Magellan makes his position pretty clear with the following declaration. You will not set 1 foot outside of this prison. So one prisoner setting 1 foot, 1 step outside of Impel Down is considered a failure of unacceptable proportions. But unfortunately, the quest for perfection is always doomed to fail. Just ask old mate Charlotte Carter-Curry. What's he up to right now? Probably not much because he failed. So really, there's only so many plates that Magellan can keep spinning before they all come tumbling down. And that's really the only victory we get to take from Magellan. The fact that Luffy and the other prisoners defeated the symbol of Impel Down, which to me isn't as satisfying as your typical One Piece villain resolutions. But you do need to remember that Magellan is a Paramount War antagonist, which is the only saga in One Piece that really differs from the typical formula. Every other saga in the series has this end goal of defeating a major antagonist, but during the Paramount War, the goal of every arc was essentially just to escape. On Sabati, they had to escape Kizaru, then Luffy had to escape from Amazon Lily, Lily. During the war itself, we had to escape from Akainu, and of course, during Impel Down, we had to escape from Magellan. Although I will say that it was very satisfying to see Luffy's combination with Mr. 3, and there's even a very brief moment where it looks like we may have cracked Magellan, like when Luffy figured out how to hit Crocodile. But that moment is incredibly fleeting, and one mere poison upgrade later, we are back to fleeing for our lives. And in the end, we really did only barely escape with the help of a wax wall, a giant stab, and a big ol' wink from Ivankov. Oh, and also, if it wasn't for the Blackbeard pirates, all of that still would have been for nothing because Magellan ordered a pursuit ship, so we really do have to thank the Blackbeard pirates for defeating Magellan off screen on our behalf. But again, that is not satisfying. The villain was beaten by another villain and we didn't even get to see it. Yeah. But also, I do need to bring this up. Initially, one of the most painfully satisfying things about Magellan is that he was a villain who did lasting damage, because Impel Down ends with the strong implication that Magellan kills Bon Clay, one of the most beloved characters, and that feat alone would skyrocket Magellan's score in this tier list. However, the whole situation gets heavily undermined when we discover that Bon Clay is still alive on the cover page of chapter 666. Don't get me wrong, I love that Bon Clay's still alive, but it definitely lessens the overall impact of Magellan significantly, especially after he went and said, any last words, Bon Clay? I mean, he probably didn't say it like that, but that is the traditional indicator of I'm going to kill you now. But what I guess Magellan meant is, any last words, Bon Clay, to your friends who have just escaped? Because you, Bon Clay, have been a very naughty boy, and we're going to lock you in a dungeon for a long time. It just doesn't quite hit as hard, and I do think it contributes to Magellan being one of the more forgettable One Piece villains. Honestly, a lot of fans can't even name him. For example, when I ask a lot of you for your input as to the next villain we should rank on this tier list, a lot of people just commented, hey, can you do what's his name, the poison guy from the jail? And that's not an amazing impression to have left on an audience. But in the end, that is Magellan's legacy. Less of the actual character and more of the general concept of poison. He's probably the villain that has given Luffy the greatest gift, being poison resistance and poison awareness, something that we are still seeing to this very day, such as recently in chapter 1111, when Luffy was immediately able to recognize a poisonous attack from Saint Saturn because it was similar to what Magellan used against him. So Magellan's effect, it is undeniably profound, but as an antagonist, or I guess as a character in general, he doesn't have anywhere near the staying power as almost every other antagonist. And we can see this most clearly in his post-Impel Down character arc. Something I didn't have space to mention previously is Magellan's relationship with Hannibal, because Magellan does also have this motivation of keeping Hannibal off his back, as all throughout Impel Down, Hannibal can barely string a sentence together without demanding that Magellan resigns so that he can become the new Chief Warden of Impel Down. And eventually, this does become a reality. We don't really hear much about Magellan until Punk Hazard, when we learn that he was demoted to Vice Warden and that Hannibal is now the Chief Warden, which is what he always wanted. And I guess that just goes to show that manifesting works. Hannibal kept saying that he wanted to become the new Warden, and then it happened. But it happened in a way that makes sense, because Magellan did fail to prevent the greatest disaster that had ever been inflicted on Impel Down. The symbol was compromised, and so he was demoted. Magellan also has a pretty nasty looking scar from whatever the Blackbeard pirates did to him, and also one of his wings was damaged and patched up with assorted metals. With that said, it's not all bad news for Magellan though, because we did get some insight into his personal life, and apparently during the last 2 years, Sadi fell in love with him, and now he's known as the quote, most trustworthy man in hell. Other than that, Magellan has been pretty disappointingly quiet, with the last reference to him, I believe, coming from chapter 906, where Doflamingo is shown allegedly talking to Magellan, but we don't actually see him. So Magellan feels like an incomplete antagonist, and not in a good way, because there are going to be other incomplete antagonists that we do need to rank as part of this journey, such as Blackbeard, Sakazuki, maybe even Emu, but they're incomplete because Oda is setting them up for bigger roles down the line. In the case of Sakazuki and Blackbeard, they've both progressed, one becoming a fleet admiral and the other becoming an emperor of the sea. But Magellan hasn't progressed. In fact, he's actively gone backwards, which indicates to me that we're done with him. If he does return in the future, it's not going to be in a major role, and so he'll always feel a little bit unsatisfyingly incomplete to me, which is a shame because his threat level was superb, his motivation was incredibly solid, and even amongst One Piece villains, he stands out as unique. But then again, probably due to his agoraphobia, he chooses to stand out in a dark corner where very few people see and or remember him. And while I do think that Magellan is incredibly underrated as a villain, it's mostly because people forget that he exists in order to actually rate him. So if he'd had a more lasting effect, then I could see Magellan being an A, but in comparison to every other villain in One Piece, I can't justify giving him any more than a B tier. And you let me know in the comments comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Jack, and he is my personal most controversial antagonist in One Piece. With Jack, it's almost like Eiichiro Oda was running an experiment to see how well he could set up a character, and then just how efficiently he could waste every drop of potential from said setup. Jack he's so conflicting. There is so much about him that is so frustratingly good, and it's all in service of the, well, you'll find out. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the disaster that is Jack the Drought. Jack was the main antagonist of the Zou arc, where he was sent to the Phantom Island to recover Raizo. Jack is one of Kaido's all-stars with an ancient Zoan devil fruit that allows him to transform into a big bulky mammoth, meaning that yes, he was an elephant sent to an elephant during the Elephant arc. And Jack, mate, he was a big deal, because his job was to portray the threat of an Emperor of the Sea, which was a concept that we were only just starting to explore at the time. So Jack needed to stroll in and make every villain before him look utterly insignificant, and he did a bit too good of a job of that. On Zou, we met Jack the Drought, a man so devastating that nothing less than a natural disaster can accurately describe him. Everywhere he goes is left barren, decrepit, and destroyed, and he was worth a mind-boggling 1 billion berries. Jack was the first character in the series to have a bounty in the billion range, and whilst it looks almost quaint compared to modern standards, this was unfathomable at the time. Before Jack, the highest known bounties in the series sat at around the 500 million range, being Luffy post Dressrosa, and then we also had Ace at 550 million. This right here was the known bounty ceiling, and back in that day, people were speculating that only someone like Roger could have possibly made it to the billion berry mark. But then cut to Zou and installs this random elephant dude who isn't even the captain of his own crew, and he destroys the bounty ceiling by doubling the highest known amounts. It made it very clear to us that even after beating Doflamingo, Luffy had such a long way to go. Because again, this wasn't even the Emperor in question that we need to defeat. This was a minion of the Emperor. And Jack's first full panel introduction at the end of chapter 807 exudes this power fantastically. What we're seeing here is Oda's classic dramatic shading. Whenever he really wants to make an impact, he switches to this hyper-realistic shading style. I mean, hyper-realistic compared to the traditional One Piece style. And it's almost as if the character is transcending the generally flat and vibrant world of One Piece and making a threatening incursion into reality. Also, very small note about this panel because I will never have an opportunity to talk about it anywhere else. In this panel, one of the minks standing in front of Jack has a shirt with Milky on the back. She's the mink who Chopper is just a little bit head over hooves for, and it appears that amongst the mink tribe, she even has her own merch. Shortly after, there's also another mink named Monji who makes the mistake of trying to reason with Jack. He says, "We would never wish for battle, but we will not find a solution to the issue if you do not listen. Jack, you said your name was? There will be no lies from us." After which point, Jack destroys a building and states, "Have we come to bargain, Jinrami?" "No, Master Jack. We came to seize a samurai." And really, that should have been expected because you cannot bargain with a natural disaster. What Monji did there was like walking up to a tornado and saying, "Now you listen here, Mr. Tornado. We're not going to achieve anything by just being a narrow, violently rotating column of air," and then being surprised when the tornado goes and destroys his monkey house. Despite this, Monji tries to reason with Jack one last time, imploring him to speak with Duke Inuarashi, to which Jack replies, "Speak? No." And I love this because the word speak, it is so offensive to Jack. Just suggesting that Jack engage in a non-violent act is a legitimate trigger for him, which you can see by the strained and cracked mammoth eyes. He's not happy. And Jack has a pretty horrifyingly intriguing way of conducting business, because this is his proposal to the mink tribe. "Let me say this. If the samurai is here, we stop attacking. If he's not, it's a crime." Which is essentially saying, if you're guilty, you're innocent, and if you're innocent, you're guilty. Either way, it doesn't matter. Jack gets what he wants. He either accomplishes his mission or he gets to feel the rush of destruction. Ideally both. Which results in this mind-boggled expression from Inuarashi, a dog man who realizes that he's come into conflict with a true beast. And something that really helps with this impression is that Oda introduced Jack in his full Zoan form. And it actually takes 3 chapters before we meet Jack in his base form. Which is really cool because keeping him in this prolonged animal state helps us to get to know the real Jack. It reduces was the risk of humanizing him in any way, because the mammoth form is much more true to who he is on the inside. Although I should say the very first time we see anything of Jack is in chapter 801, where we are treated to a close-up of his eye, which is like looking into the killing instinct of a wild creature. And I imagine that you're all probably very familiar with this eye, because in total across Zoe, there are 16 close-ups of Jack's single eye. Now, to put that into some perspective, not counting these eye close-ups, there are a total of 19 panels of Jack in his human form and 20 panels of Jack in his mammoth form across Zoe. So almost a third of every panel featuring Jack is that close-up of his eye. That is an insane ratio, and he only spends 1/3 of his time in this arc depicted with any sort of humanity. So when reading Zoe, it is very clear that he is meant to be portrayed as a true beast of this world, and that inhuman nature was very evident in Jack's raw power. He fought the mink leaders Inuarashi and Nekomamushi for 5 days straight, and they took turns with Jack. Inuarashi fought him by day and Nekomamushi fought him by night. Jack wasn't allowed a single moment to rest for the whole 5 days, and he still fought the entire tribe to a standstill, because it wasn't just Inuarashi and Nekomamushi. He absolutely took on the whole tribe, which is made clear in my favorite quote about Jack. We were unable to stop Jack's reinforcements from continually arriving by sea. They were like an unstoppable zombie army, but over time, we steadily and surely overcame the enemy. If anything, there was just one place we couldn't break them down, and that was Jack, for he is truly a monster. Which gets even worse when you realize that Jack could have ended this fight at any time thanks to the poisonous gas, but he chose to engage in this prolonged destruction. He chose to keep stacking up losses on both sides. There was no logic to it, and why would there be? He's a natural disaster. He doesn't operate on logic. So Jack is a rare example of an antagonist that I will forego one of my usual criteria for, which is having an understandable motivation. Because throughout his run in One Piece, Jack has never been a character that I could even begin to understand what makes him tick and why. But that is the whole point of his natural disaster theme. Again, you don't ask the tornado why it's doing the thing it's doing. It's just nature. And there's a very poetic nature to Jack's defeat via the trunk of Zunisha. So most people are satisfied by the irony of Jack being defeated by a bigger version of himself. Big elephant defeats small elephant, who we thought was big elephant, but not compared to the really big elephant. But it is so much deeper than that. Jack is a personified natural disaster who was beaten by Zunisha, a personified island. Personified or zoomorphized, I guess. I don't really care which. What I care about is that Jack's defeat was so satisfying to me because this conflict was bigger than individuals. It was a battle of nature, and the land, as it always does, endured against the natural disaster. I really don't think that Oda has ever done a better job of setting up a villain. Even when compared to some of the greatest antagonist introductions like Kaido falling from the sky and Kizaru versus the worst generation on Sabaody, to me, neither of them hits as hard as this story of Jack and his relentless and unstoppable brutality. If I was judging Jack based on Zoe and Zoe alone, he'd be a solid 10 out of 10 for me. A strongly compelling, well-written, raise-the-stakes antagonist who had a perfect ending. However, this was far from the end of Jack, and what followed is, in my opinion, one of the biggest character fumbles in One Piece. Because Zoe is a small part of a bigger picture, and Jack was a building block for the Wano arc. And one of the really unfortunate things about wrapping up his idea so well on Zoe is that it didn't leave him any room to develop on Wano, as if we would have had time to explore him anyway. But Wano was the arc where we needed to take him down for good. So a big problem that emerged with Jack is that Oda, he was already done with the idea. And this is apparent right from his reintroduction. Jack is reintroduced to us, and on the very next page, he is being manhandled by Ashura Doji. As an introduction to the Samurai of Wano, this works really well. To see that there are random people on this island who can fight at the Billionberry level, but it does a huge disservice to Jack, as it immediately ruins the image of him that was built up on Zoe. Because the unstoppable natural disaster, all of a sudden it was stopped by an obese drunk riding a bull. And this is only the beginning of the complete and utter dismantling of everything that is Jack. Kaido then interrupts the fight because he wants to speak with Ashura Doji, which is kind of like having your dad step into a primary school fight. I mean, yeah, the kid you were up against, he's gonna lose, but everyone's gonna make fun of poor Jack because he needed daddy to help him. And the next time we see Jack, he's being scolded by King and Queen, who in this family metaphor would be his two older brothers. King calls Jack pathetic, and they say they don't need any more dead weight. Queen even calls him Jack the Stooge, and to all of this, how does Jack respond? Well, he submits. He apologizes to King and Queen. And it's like, who even is this guy? 100 chapters ago, Jack would have raised an entire country at the mere suggestion of needing to speak to someone, let alone alone having someone speak to him like this. And now what we're seeing here, it's not a natural disaster anymore. It's just a plain disaster. And I should say that this does actually fit quite well with Jack's age. He looks a lot older due to, general bigliness, but Jack is only 28 years old. Meanwhile, King is in his late 40s, whilst Queen and Kaido are both in their 50s. Kaido's even pushing 60. So Jack is genuinely the child of the group, and in fact, he was only 8 years old when Kaido commandeered Wano. But even 20 years later, it seems that when we're on Wano, Jack still feels like he's 8 years old. And after he loses a rematch against Inuarashi and Nekomamushi on Onigashima, Kaido even has to do the classic dad thing of consoling Jack by saying, "No, my precious little elephant cake. This does not make you weak. They're just that strong." Everything we see of Jack on Wano is a complete reversal of what happened on Zou, and not in a clever narrative flip kind of way. Because breaking the facade of your characters, yes, that can work, but only if they go on to evolve and become something new. Like it did with Katakuri, portraying him as the perfect being and then slowly having him come to terms with imperfection in a very cathartic struggle. That's not even close to what happens with Jack. And something that I love is that around the time Jack is defeated by the Mink leaders, we had chapter 989, which is titled, "I Can't Imagine Losing." And when I first saw that title, I was like, mate, losing is the only thing Jack can imagine. Because one of the biggest disservices that Oda did to this character was never giving him even a single victory. Jack couldn't beat the Minks without the poison gas on Zou. He was defeated by Doflamingo's marine escort team. He was beaten by Zunesha. His fight with Ashura Doji wasn't going very well before Daddy interrupted. The Sulong Minks annihilated him, and Jack's final fight saw him defeated by Inuarashi alone. To be fair, in that last case, it has about as good of a conclusion as it could have. In the end, the final attack Inuarashi used against Jack was a canine cleaver using his prosthetic sword leg, so he beat Jack with the very limb that Jack removed from him on Zou. But as it turns out, the unstoppable Jack is quite easily and frequently stopped. In fact, in One Piece history, he's never not been stopped. He failed all of his missions, lost all of his fights, and I usually don't like boiling characters down to a simple win-loss ratio, but it's really hard to avoid when that is Jack's character. There really is nothing deeper going on here than battle, and he's not even very good at that. And that becomes problematic for me, because all of the praise I gave to his unneeded motivational aspects earlier, all of that very much disappears when you remove that natural disaster idea. During Wano, Jack is no longer the personification of a force of nature, and that makes me want a lot more depth from the character, depth which never arrives. The best we get is that the Wano arc coincided with the release of the One Piece Vivia Card Databook, which gave us a lot of weird information about certain characters, and one thing it revealed about Jack is that his hobby is lawn mowing. And this could not be more appropriate to demonstrate his current status. Jack used to be a natural disaster, a man who would wipe the earth clean of all life. But in his current state, the best he can do is hop on a lawnmower and cut some grass on a Sunday morning before returning to his 9 to 5 at Kaido Corp on Monday, where he's constantly being berated by the middle management of King and Queen. But here's the most telling thing about Jack on Wano. There isn't a single situation where Oda uses the trademark Jack single eye close-up in this whole arc. Remember that Oda used this device a whopping 16 times on Zou, and Zou was only 23 chapters long, so that is a very high percentage of Jack eyeball happening here, whereas Wano is 149 chapters long, and not once do we see the signature artistic device that Jack is known for. And I don't think Oda just forgot, he definitely did this on purpose. And that's because Jack, he didn't deserve these close-ups, because the fearsome beast of Zou is not present on Wano. Zou Jack and Wano Jack are two completely different characters, and being the most generous I can would be to say that Jack was sacrificed to build up King, Queen, and Kaido. The idea that the unstoppable monster we met on Zou was basically the pet of the true monsters that we now have to face on Wano. And I do appreciate that idea, but it doesn't change much about Jack himself, which is a problem because this video is about Jack. I mean, sure, there could be a purpose to cutting off his narrative balls, but that doesn't make him not a narrative eunuch. So I do think that King was very correct in his assessment of Jack being dead weight, because narratively, Jack is dead weight in the Wano arc. Oda implemented the idea of Jack brilliantly on Zou, and I personally believe that's where the concept of Jack should have been laid to rest. Get rid of him being a fisherman and just have him drown after being attacked by Zunesha. Now, speaking of Jack, he's a fisherman. The reason why I haven't mentioned it until now is because it never really became relevant relevant, which is a shame because again, it was such a cool idea. Other than Vanderdecken, Jack is the only Fishman devil fruit user we've encountered to date, and I do feel like that whole angle was a bit wasted. I would have loved to find out how a Fishman became a member of the Beast Pirates. And I do feel quite strongly about not having Jack be a part of Wano at all, outside of flashbacks maybe. You could do what Whole Cake Island did with Charlotte Snack. He was a sweet commander who was beaten before the arc even started. So he was pushed into the background in the manga. I think we see him like once and didn't take an active part. So what we do is the same thing with Jack by acknowledging his death on Zou and maybe even using his open all-star spot as some motivation for the Toby Roppo to work towards promotion. It may have even removed a very small part of what made Wano feel so bloated, because I really don't think that we lose much, if anything, by removing Jack from the arc. And it may even enhance his legacy. If he wasn't in Wano at all, then he'd have this reputation of, well, just imagine if Jack had been on Onigashima. Then the Alliance would have been in trouble because that guy, he was unstoppable. He needed an entire island to take him down. And overall, I think it's a real shame that Jack went down this path. Like I said, if I was only ranking him based on Zou, then Jack would be up there with the very best of the series. But as time went on and his role dragged out, it became apparent that I don't think anyone is more deserving of the title of fraud than Jack. So in the end, I can't bring myself to give Jack anything higher than a C tier, and he should thank me for that. And the only reason he's that high is purely because of Zou. He had so much potential, more so than at least half the villains that we're going to be talking about, but it was all in service of what ultimately became very little, and Jack's legacy in One Piece is now more of a meme than an actual character. But you let me know in the comments, which major antagonist would you like to rank next? This is Buggy, a character who was once able to Zechiro Oda's favorite villain in all of One Piece. However, this came from an extraordinarily early interview, and I want to know how Buggy stacks up to what One Piece became. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the genius jester, Buggy the Clown. And I should say this right at the beginning, Buggy is very difficult to examine as a villain, because the character very much transcends that classification, to the point where these days he's completely unrecognizable from his debut arc, which would be Orange Town, where Buggy had the honor of being the first villain introduced with Oda's now signature dramatic shading style. Buggy is the first one to properly take advantage of that enhanced tangibility. Hickman the Bear and Captain Morgan were given flat full body introductions, and Alvida, yeah, she did have that effect to some degree, but it was quite bland. Oda hadn't quite yet landed on his soon to be solid technique yet. And look, even Buggy, it's a bit basic compared to the next 24 years of villains that Oda would draw. But this is Oda's aesthetic grammar to let us know that we need to take this seriously, which I think was very necessary given that we were dealing with a literal clown. Although if you read the official One Piece volumes, then you may even have a much more serious impression, because your first introduction to Buggy would have been right after chapter 7, where there's this curious page filled with Shanks, Buggy, and a bunch of other mostly obscured piratey folk looming over a map with some text describing the great age of piracy. And as a first exposure to Buggy, it's pretty powerful because it paints him as being on a similar level to Shanks. So that when Luffy does encounter Buggy at Orange Town, it's like, oh no, we need to find someone as powerful as Shanks? This is not good. And not only that, but we need to take on someone significantly less merciful. Buggy's introduction is pretty wild because it establishes his sensitivity to the word nose and also any associated homophones, for which he punishes one of his crew members by raising him into the air and blasting him to pieces with a point-blank Buggy ball to the face, which is a maneuver so brutal that the anime made the decision to censor it, and instead the crew member begs for his life and Buggy shows mercy. Which I have to say, since we're examining villains, pretty weak move on Toei's part, because manga Buggy establishes himself as a true force to be reckoned with. Although even that is a diluted version of Oda's original idea for Buggy. His name was going to be Boogie, and he was supposed to be much closer to the Joker in terms of both personality and aesthetics, with a design that borders on realism, or I guess as close as realism in One Piece gets, which I think was quite rightfully deemed inconsistent with the One Piece world, and so the design was given a layer of cartoonishness. But in the very early chapters of Orange Town, make no mistake, the character that we're reading is still Boogie, and it takes a bit for Buggy to evolve out of the serial killer crime boss persona. Buggy also has the distinction of being the first devil fruit using opponent that Luffy faces. And whilst the chop chop fruit is, still quite wacky, it also shows us just how dangerous these fruit abilities can be. Because did you know that Buggy and Drake Mihawk have 3 things in common. Firstly, they're both currently members of Cross Guild. Secondly, they were both warlords of the sea. And thirdly, they have both defeated one Roanoa Zoro. What really made me sit up and take Buggy seriously was when he was able to wound Zoro. Because you can call it fighting dirty, nasty, uncouth, and all of the other synonyms. But mate, that's piracy. We don't live in a world of honor, and what Buggy did was a solid tactical maneuver. To which Luffy responds, stabbing someone in the back. That's fighting dirty. You got that, big nose? And you can tell that this is early One Piece because here Luffy is a bit inconsistent with his own philosophy on piracy. In fact, decades later in the fight against Katakuri, Luffy says the exact opposite. There's no such thing as fighting dirty in a battle between pirates. It was my fault for not being able to dodge. So for chapter 9 of the series, Buggy is a properly threatening villain in the manga. In the anime, it's not as much. However, even in the manga, Buggy's motivation this early on is a bit generic. He wants to, quote, rule the Grand Line. And why does he want to rule the Grand Line? Well, it's so that all the glittering treasure will be mine. All the treasure in the world. I'll have it and nobody else. Which I find pretty unexciting and not particularly compelling for a villain. But that's because it's not about Buggy. At this stage, he's not written to be a fully fleshed out character of his own. He was written for the function of exploring an idea. Back before One Piece evolved into these complex mega arcs, each small arc had an idea of its own to portray, and in the case of Orange Town, that idea is treasure. It's where we heavily emphasize that Luffy's treasure is his straw hat, Choo-Choo's treasure is his master's dog food, and Mayor Boodle's treasure is the town itself, etc. Everyone has their own treasure, and Buggy is here to represent that very tangible, classical, shiny, and monetary notion of treasure. He even says it as much himself. He only cares for gold and jewels and stuff along those lines. And he considers Orange Town treasure for termites. A dump that doesn't sparkle, no, it only rots. He's there to represent that superficial treasure, which I think is actually best highlighted on the cover of chapter 16, where we see Buggy, Moji, and Kabaji each engaging in their own superficial activities. Moji looking at himself in a mirror, Kabaji doing the same but with daggers, and in the middle, Buggy is having a nice romantic getaway with all of his gold, even pouring it a drink, no doubt with the aim to intoxicate and take advantage of it because he really loves that treasure. And I'm a bit conflicted with this because I like the idea that Oda's expressing and it does work flawlessly, especially when Buggy starts targeting the straw hat and his very existence becomes a direct challenge to the idea of Luffy's treasure. But it does make early Buggy feel a little bit flat. He has very little room for nuance because he serves a strict mechanical purpose, like a load-bearing column in a building. You can't really do much except acknowledge its purpose and move on with your life. However, things do get a bit more interesting when Buggy's connection to Shanks is revealed, because that at least gives him a solid motivation for wanting to do all of these bad things to Luffy, and that's motivation that only makes more sense in retrospect once you learn about Buggy's side of the story and how much faith he put in Shanks, only for Shanks to purposely not live up to those expectations. And I am so glad that that stuff is in there, because Buggy's connection to Shanks allowed him to keep his foot in the narrative door and eventually become the magnificent being that he is today. However, throughout Orange Town, Buggy remains sufficiently unhinged and unpredictable. And these days it's difficult to picture Buggy being this brutal, but he is threatening to kill people every couple of pages. He says he's going to kill his crew for losing to Luffy, then he's going to kill Luffy for beating his crew. He's also going to kill Nami for not killing Luffy, and these aren't empty threats either, because we've already seen him kill someone in his introduction. But over the course of Orange Town, Buggy becomes less scary and much more hilarious. And for me, the true turning point is when Moji returns after being beaten by Luffy, and he's trying to explain Luffy's powers, but he can only manage to say, "Beware the rub." And Buggy's conclusion is that boy must have used some sort of diabolical rubbing technique on him, as if Luffy won by doing whatever the reverse of a happy ending is. And as the fight goes on, Buggy makes these increasingly funny and contorted faces befitting of a clown. But the full conversion into the Buggy we know and love, for me, happens on this page where Luffy kicks him in the Buggy balls, which is one of my favorite One Piece panels of all time. These days, it's very rare that Oda uses that zoomed out blank white background, because it's meant to put a huge dramatic emphasis on the action to become a striking, iconic image. For example, the classic "People's Dreams Don't Ever End" page from Jaya. And to me, Buggy being sack-whacked is played with that same sort of level of drama, but because the drama is so inappropriately heightened, it becomes absurdist comedy, which is exactly what Buggy is. He is a farce. As a villain, he follows the same sort of trajectory as an antagonist in a pantomime. Someone who is introduced with an air of seriousness, but is perpetually undermined with an over-the-top portrayal, and often gets used as a bit of a comedic punching bag, and in the end being completely diminished of status, which is exactly what happens to Buggy at the end of Orange Town, when he's forced to become a chibi version of himself himself because Nami took all of his body parts, which I think is a fantastic ending for him. But everything we've spoken about only makes up a teeny tiny fraction of what is Buggy. To continue his series of firsts, Buggy is the recipient of the inaugural One Piece cover story, which started a beloved trend of seeing former villains having their own low-stakes character arcs and making that transition into comic relief side characters. And while Buggy's story is mostly packed with wacky shenaniganry like chasing after a bird to eat with this comically large knife and fork, it does contain something I really appreciate, which is when Buggy finds himself on Gaimon's island. And Gaimon, you may remember, has an arc revolving around treasure as well, having spent 2 decades trying to reach his beloved shiny objects, only to discover that the chests were in fact empty. So Gaimon and Buggy becoming friends is brilliant because it's kind of like a Treasureaholics Anonymous meeting. You've got these 2 recovering wealth addicts coming together in the middle of absolutely nowhere, celebrating their discovery that treasure takes many forms, which then prompts Buggy to set sail to reunite with his former crew, who he now sees in a new light. It's a proper full circle character arc, kind of similar to how Nami evolved. After Arlong, she's still very money focused, but with an appreciation for the more important things in life. And that's Buggy as well. After his adventure, he shows noticeably more humanity and empathy, but let's not go too far because Buggy isn't quite done being a villain yet. He does of course return during Logtown and almost successfully executes Luffy, which is a pretty solid claim to fame, but this is the last time that I would really classify Buggy as a villain, which is funny because at this point we're only 1/11th of the way into One Piece and there is so much more Buggy to come. Although at this point I do want to remind everyone that this is a villain tier list video and not a fully blown character analysis. With some antagonists, those two become practically the same thing, but Buggy is an entirely different beast. For the vast majority of One Piece, I don't even consider Buggy to be a villain. I always think of him as more of an awkward protagonist. And then I remember, oh yeah, he was a villain about a gazillion years ago. His antagonism is an afterthought to me, because something that One Piece is really good at doing is making this world feel real by giving every character their own ambition and progress, so that everyone is the protagonist of their own story, playing out in tandem with Luffy's. But that is much more true of Buggy than almost anyone else. He met Luffy at the romance dawn of One Piece, and both of them have progressed in parallel to one another. As Luffy gains notoriety, so does Buggy. He gains equal notoriety. And there is this great moment after Impel Down where a Marine reports, "We've identified the 2 ringleaders from the prison's video transmission. They are the pirate captain Straw Hat Luffy and Buggy the Clown." Which is fantastic because you've got these characters like Ivankov, Jinbei, and Crocodile who were all more significantly more involved, but Buggy is given a whopping 50% of the credit, which only continues to snowball from there. After the war, when Luffy became a 400 million berry criminal, Buggy was offered a warlord position, and by the time Luffy was ready to ascend to becoming an Emperor of the Sea, Buggy had practically already beaten him to the mark. If you look at One Piece purely through Buggy's eyes, he's gathered his own crew step by step, and even an entire grand fleet just like Luffy did. And it's at the point where, in my opinion, apart from Luffy, Buggy is the most serious narrative contender to become the Pirate King, because Buggy has followed Luffy's progression at every step, so why should this final step be any different? And I dare say we may even be experiencing Buggy in reverse at the moment. With Orange Town, we encountered a serious character who turned into a complete farce, and throughout the rest of One Piece, we've been watching a complete farce ascend towards a serious character. It's been a very slow journey, mind you, like watching water erode cliffs, but we are getting there. And I can show you 3 perfect panels to demonstrate that, which are from the beginning, middle, and final saga of One Piece. Back in Orange Town, it's also implied that Buggy wants to become the Pirate King, but he doesn't outright say it. When Luffy states his ambition, Buggy just replies, "Then what am I? God of the pirates?" So Buggy, he has that desire, but it's internalized. He doesn't yet have the willpower to actually make that declaration yet. Then cut to the middle of One Piece after Impel Down, and our Buggy has a lot more confidence. He thinks to himself that yeah, he could become one of the 4 emperors and then king of the pirates. The key word there being think. He still can't bring himself to actually say that he wants to become the Pirate King. Instead, he says, "If you call yourselves men, then follow me to glory. Today, I will take Whitebeard's head and rule the world." Which is a pretty awesome declaration, but it's nowhere near what it needs to be. And we wouldn't get there until chapter 1082, where it's revealed that Buggy actually gave up on his own dream because of how much he believed in Shanks. And when Shanks said, quote, "I've changed my mind," Buggy was destroyed. Because consider it this way. Instead of starting his own dream company, Buggy invested his dream capital into Shanks Corp. And immediately after Buggy invested his life savings, Shanks announced the closure of his dream company with no refunds, so Buggy was kicked out onto the street with no dream liquidity whatsoever. Of course, Buggy held this grudge towards Shanks and anyone else related to Shanks, because I really don't think I can emphasize just how much Shanks shattered Buggy in this moment, and he really could not have worded his intentions more terribly. However, in chapter 1082, when Buggy hears that Shanks is actually making a move for the One Piece, the thing it is that he wanted Shanks to do this entire time, Buggy's reaction is to say F it. Whether by fate or accident, I'm on the same level as him now. If he's gonna do it, then I want to be king of the pirates. And Buggy finally earnestly says his dream out loud, because this time he's not gonna put his belief in someone else. He wants to do it himself. For the first time in well over 1,000 chapters, Buggy has the will to take that first step, and so has made his full conversion into a character to be taken seriously. Not so much as a villain this time, but as a rival. And look, we've definitely gotten a bit off track here, but what I will say is if you juxtapose the introduction of Buggy against the chapter 1082 Buggy, it is a night and day difference. Of every villain in One Piece, Buggy has easily had the most satisfying post-antagonist character arc. But that's not quite why we're here. As stated earlier, evaluating Buggy as a villain is difficult, and I think this decision might be a bit controversial because he is one of the greatest characters of One Piece in my opinion. However, 99% of that greatness comes after his tenure as a villain. Honestly, he's part of this video series more as a technicality because he did helm his own arc, but when we have to narrow our focus to that comparatively brief time when Buggy was an antagonist, then sure, he's great by Romance Dawn or maybe even East Blue standards, but he has a real difficult time standing up to the greatest and even middest of villains down the line. So I'm going to plonk Buggy into the D tier. So I'm going to plonk Buggy into the B tier, and that's because as a villain, he is serviceable, fun, and a really great tool to convey the idea of treasure, and goes on to have this magnificent journey afterwards, but he doesn't have the sheer antagonistic impact of true villains like Arlong, Crocodile, Doflamingo, Enel, etc. Because Buggy is just too big to be condensed into such a narrow classification. And he really does deserve a re-examination under non-strictly villain criteria, but for now, it is what it is. But you know what? I think the consolation prize of potentially becoming the Pirate King will more than make up for whatever injustice is being done here today. But you let me know in the comments which major antagonist you'd like to rank next.